Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Pages of History. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders settle. Let your hands rest. If there is anything left from the day that still feels unfinished, allow it to soften for now. It will keep until morning. Tonight, there is nowhere else to be, and nothing else that needs doing. Tonight, we are simply going to drift together into one of the oldest and most quietly remarkable worlds that ever existed. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slow journeys through the past, you are always welcome to subscribe and join us each evening. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. It is always a pleasure to know. Now, let us begin. Close your eyes if that feels right, and allow the world around you to grow still. Picture, somewhere very far away, the last light of an ancient day. The sun is low on the horizon. It moves toward the edge of the desert in the way it always has, slowly, without urgency, the way it moved 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and long before any of us arrived to notice it. The sky shifts through shades of amber and copper and the faintest rose, and then, gradually, the blue deepens overhead, and the first stars begin to appear. Below that sky, there is a river. It moves quietly through an otherwise still landscape. On either side of its banks, the land is green and narrow, vivid strip of green running through a world that, beyond its edges, is nothing but sand and stone and silence. The river is wide in places, calm in places, and it catches the last of the evening light on its surface, the way still water always does. Somewhere along its bank, a palm tree shifts gently in a low desert breeze. A bird calls once, and then settles. This is the Nile, and it is, in every sense that matters, the beginning of our story tonight. This river, running for thousands of miles through northeastern Africa, was not simply a feature of the landscape. It was the landscape. It was the reason people settled here. It was the reason cities rose from the earth. It was the reason grain grew, and families flourished, and temples were built so large that their walls still stand today. Without the Nile, there would be no story to tell. There would only be desert. But the Nile was here. And so, beside it came one of the longest and most extraordinary civilizations in all of human history. We are speaking tonight of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, a world that endured, in one form or another, for more than 3,000 years. A world of pharaohs and farmers, of scribes and sailors, of temples carved from living rock and homes made from the mud of the river itself. A world where the annual flood was as certain as the sunrise, where the stars were read like a calendar, where the names of the dead were written carefully into stone so that they might never entirely disappear. It is a world worth knowing quietly, and that is what we will do tonight. We will not rush through ancient Egypt as though it were a list of dates or a sequence of rulers. We will drift through it the way a boat moves along the Nile slowly, with attention to the banks on either side, noticing the fields and the reeds and the distant shimmer of the desert, noticing the ordinary people who lived their lives between the water and the sand. We will move from the very beginning, from the first settlements gathering beside the river, through the great ages of pyramid building and temple worship, through the long centuries of farming and craft and sacred ritual, through the lives of queens and kings and children and animals, and eventually, gently, toward the quiet end, toward the moment when this ancient world faded, and the sand began to cover what remained, and the long silence began. But even in that silence, something survived. It is one of the remarkable things about ancient Egypt. Not only the pyramids, which are visible from a great distance and have been visited and written about for centuries. Not only the great temples, with their enormous painted columns and their carved walls, but also the smaller things, a sandal left in a tomb, a child's toy, a letter written on a broken piece of pottery, a recipe scratched into clay, a name carved carefully into stone, still legible after 4,000 years. These things survived, and through them, the people who made them survive, in a small and quiet way as well. There is something deeply reassuring about that. History, at its best, is not only the story of the powerful, it is also the story of the quiet and the ordinary, the people who waited for the flood, who ground the grain, who painted the walls, who carried water from the river in clay jars, who sat with their families at the end of a long day and watched the same stars that you and I can still find if we look up on a clear night. So allow yourself to settle a little further into whatever is comfortable. Let the room around you grow softer. Let the day drift a little further away. The Nile is moving gently in the darkness, just as it always has. The desert is cooling around it. The first lights of an ancient village are flickering to life along the bank. Somewhere in the distance, the outline of a great stone structure rises against the darkening sky patient, enormous and entirely still. We have arrived in ancient Egypt, and tonight, together, we will walk quietly through all of it. There is a way of understanding ancient Egypt that has nothing to do with rulers or temples or battles. It begins instead with a map, or rather, with the absence of one, because if you had stood somewhere high in the desert east of the Nile, perhaps on a pale limestone ridge above the valley, and looked westward on a clear morning, what you would have seen was not complicated at all. On one side, the river. Beside the river, a narrow band of green. And beyond that green, in every direction, a vast and motionless red. That was Egypt. Not a nation in the way we tend to picture nations today, with their invisible borders and their administrative regions and their colored sections on political maps. Egypt was, at its most essential, a ribbon, a long, narrow, improbable ribbon of living land running through one of the driest places on earth. The Egyptians themselves understood this clearly. They had a name for it. They called the fertile land along the river the Black Land Kemet, in their own language, named for the dark, rich soil that the Nile left behind after each annual flood. And they called the desert beyond it the Red Land Deshret, a vast, hostile, sun-bleached world of sand and rock and wind. These two lands were not simply geographic categories. They were a way of thinking about the world. Life existed in one place, and silence existed everywhere else. The border between them was not gradual. In many places, it was almost immediate. A traveler could stand with one foot on soft black soil and the other on hard, pale desert sand. The transition was, in a sense, the most important boundary in all of Egypt. And that boundary was maintained by one thing alone: the river. The Nile runs for more than 4,000 miles from its sources in Central and Eastern Africa to its mouth on the Mediterranean coast. Along most of that journey, it moves through landscapes that offer very little. But in northeastern Africa, as it flows north through what is now Egypt, it carves a valley through the limestone plateau. And in that valley, the The conditions for life are extraordinary. The soil is deep and dark and immensely productive. The water is reliable. The sun is constant. And for the people who first understood how to work with these conditions rather than against them, the rewards were remarkable. A traveler moving down the Nile from the south would have entered Egypt through a landscape of gentle cliffs and narrow valley walls. This southern region, what the Egyptians called Upper Egypt, despite being geographically higher in elevation, was a long, relatively confined stretch of river running between pale rock and irrigated fields. The valley here was not especially wide, in places only a few miles from cliff to cliff, but within that width, every available piece of black soil was precious. Villages gathered close to the water. Fields ran right to the edge of the desert. Date palms stood in rows along the bank, their fronds catching whatever breeze moved off the river in the afternoon. Donkeys worked the irrigation channels. Children played near the water. Farmers watched the sky and the surface of the river with the patience of people who had learned that the land would provide, if you were willing to wait for it and work with it in return. As the river moved north, the valley gradually widened. The cliffs pulled back, the horizon opened, and eventually, not far south of what is now Cairo, the single channel of the Nile reached the point where it began to divide. This was the Delta. The Nile Delta was a different world from the narrow valley of the south. Here, the river spread itself into multiple channels. Some accounts suggest there were once as many as 7 major branches, though many of these have since silted over or changed course across the centuries. Between those channels, the delta was an expanse of marshland, shallow lakes, thick papyrus reeds, and low-lying fields of extraordinary fertility. It was, in many ways, a landscape of abundance. Fish were plentiful in the channels and lagoons. Waterfowl nested in the reeds in enormous numbers: herons, ibises, ducks, geese, and birds that would have filled the morning air with sound. Papyrus grew in dense thickets along the water's edge, its tall green stalks bending slightly in the sea breeze that came off the Mediterranean to the north. The soil here was some of the richest in the ancient world, fed by millennia of flood deposits spread across a wide and level plain. A fishing boat moving quietly through one of the delta channels in the early morning would have passed through a world of reeds and mist and bird call. The water would have been shallow and dark. The papyrus stalks would have stood close on either side, so tall that a man standing in a small boat could not see over them. Beyond the reeds, fields of emmer wheat and barley extended to the horizon, and in the distance, the outlines of small settlements would have been visible mud brick walls, a few palm trees, the faint smell of bread baking in clay ovens. This was Lower Egypt, lower in the sense of downstream, closer to the sea, wider, greener, more diffuse than the narrow southern valley. And together, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt formed the essential geography that every ruler, every farmer, and every ordinary person in ancient Egyptian history would have understood as the shape of their world. Beyond both of them, the desert waited. It would be wrong to think of the desert as simply empty. The Egyptians knew it well, and they used it carefully. Along the western edge of the Nile Valley, a series of oases offered water and shade at intervals across the sand places, where underground water reached the surface and created small pockets of life in an otherwise inhospitable landscape. These oases were not wilderness outposts. They were settled. They were farmed. They were connected to the valley by roads that desert travelers had memorized over generations, reading the landscape by its ridgelines and star positions, and the behavior of the wind. The eastern desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea, was rougher and more dramatic, a landscape of dry wadis and jagged peaks and ancient riverbeds that carried water only when rare rains fell. But it was not ignored either. Beneath its surface lay gold and copper and stone of various qualities, and the routes through it led eventually to ports on the Red Sea coast, from which ships could reach distant lands. The desert, in other words, was a border and a resource at the same time. It protected Egypt from easy invasion. It also rewarded those willing to cross it. One can almost picture what it felt like to stand on the edge of that world, on the boundary between the green and the red, between the soft soil and the hard sand, between the world of the living and the quiet emptiness beyond. To feel the difference in temperature as you stepped from the shaded riverbank into the open desert. To hear the sound of the river fade behind you as the sand absorbed your footsteps and the silence of the desert settled over everything. The Egyptians never forgot that they lived at the edge of the possible. Their entire civilization was built in the narrow space where water made life work. And that awareness of water nearby, of desert beyond, of the thin green ribbon as the only place where ordinary human life could unfold, shaped the way they thought about almost everything. Their gods held back the chaos. Their pharaoh maintained the order. Their priests performed the rituals that kept the river flowing and the floods arriving on time. And beneath all of that theology and ceremony, a farmer in a field of dark soil on the edge of the Nile simply tended what the river had given and waited, as his parents and grandparents had waited, for the water to return. That patience, running quietly through thousands of years, was perhaps the most Egyptian thing of all. There is a particular kind of waiting that becomes, over generations, something close to faith. Not the anxious waiting of uncertainty, where each passing day brings fresh doubt about whether the thing hoped for will arrive, but a deeper, calmer waiting, the kind that comes from having seen the same thing happen so many times, across so many seasons, that the waiting itself becomes a form of trust, a knowledge carried not only in the mind, but in the body. In the way a farmer stands at the edge of a field and reads the color of the sky. In the way a priest watches the eastern horizon before dawn for a particular star. In the way a child grows up understanding, without being told explicitly, that the river will rise, and that when it does, everything will be well. This was the rhythm at the center of ancient Egyptian life, and it came, as almost everything in Egypt did, from the Nile. Each year, with a reliability that seemed almost miraculous to those who depended on it, the Nile flooded. Not in the destructive, unpredictable way that rivers in other parts of the world might swell and surge and tear away what people had built. The Nile's annual flood was, in ordinary years, a generous one. It rose slowly and purposefully, covering the fields of the valley with a shallow layer of water, and then, after several weeks, it retreated, leaving behind a thin, dark layer of silt. Rich, mineral-heavy, deeply fertile soil, renewed every single year by the river's generosity. This meant something extraordinary. It meant that Egyptian farmers did not need to rotate their crops in the way that farmers in other parts of the ancient world were forced to do, resting fields and allowing soil to recover. The Nile renewed the soil for them every year without fail. Fields could be planted season after season in the same place, with the same consistent results for generation after generation. The flood was not simply a natural event. It was the agricultural foundation of an entire civilization. the Egyptians gave it a name. They called the flood season Akhet, which is often translated simply as inundation. Akhet was the first of their 3 great seasons, and it lasted roughly from what we might call midsummer through early autumn. During Akhet, the fields disappeared beneath the water. Travel by land became difficult. Much of the physical labor of farming was temporarily impossible, and so the people waited, and the river moved across the land in wide, shallow sheets, and the world smelled of water and dark earth and something ancient and renewing. After Akhet came Pare, the season of emergence. As the flood retreated and the black soil reappeared, still damp and soft and immensely productive, farmers moved back into their fields. Seeds were pressed into the ground. Irrigation channels were opened and managed. Oxen pulled simple plows through the soil. The landscape, which had been a shallow inland sea only weeks before, became a working agricultural world of furrows and seedlings and people moving between the rows. And then came Shamu, the harvest season. The dry months, when the crops ripened under the steady Egyptian sun and were gathered in, threshed, sorted, and stored in the great granaries that stood at the heart of every substantial settlement. Shamu was a season of labor and reward, of grain piling up in storage rooms, of families carrying baskets and bundles, of the air tasting of dust and ripeness. 3 seasons: flood, growth, harvest, and then the flood again. It is a cycle so simple and so complete that it is almost difficult to believe it sustained one of the most complex civilizations in human history for more than 3,000 years. But it did. And the reason it could was precisely that simplicity, a rhythm so reliable, so consistent, so deeply embedded in the life of everyone who lived beside the river, that all of Egyptian society organized itself around it. The question, of course, was how to know when the flood was coming. This was not merely a practical matter, though it was certainly that. Knowing when the Nile would begin to rise allowed farmers to prepare their tools and clear their channels. It allowed administrators to organize labor and supplies. It allowed priests to arrange the ceremonies and offerings that welcomed the flood as a sacred event. It allowed ordinary families to make the small adjustments of daily life, moving animals to higher ground, securing boats, ensuring that food stores were sufficient for the weeks when the fields would be underwater. But knowing when the flood would arrive required watching the sky. The Egyptians were careful observers of the heavens, not in the way of people who gaze upward with vague wonder, but in the way of people for whom the sky was a practical calendar, a vast and reliable timepiece that announced the seasons with the rising and setting of particular stars. The most important of these was a star the Egyptians knew by several names, but which we know today as Sirius. It is the brightest star visible in the night sky, and it has a particular behavior that made it enormously significant in ancient Egypt. For a portion of each year, Sirius is not visible. It rises and sets too close to the sun to be seen against the brightness of daylight. But then, after a period of absence, it reappears. It rises just before sunrise, briefly visible on the eastern horizon in the moments before the sky brightens and swallows it again. This first reappearance, this heliacal rising, as astronomers call it, happened in ancient Egypt just before or around the time the Nile flood was expected to begin. To a priest watching the eastern sky from the roof of a temple in the pre-dawn darkness, the reappearance of Sirius was not simply an astronomical observation. It was an announcement. The river was coming. The season was turning. The year, in the deepest sense, was beginning again. The Egyptians connected Sirius with the goddess Isis, and the flood itself was sometimes described as the tears of Isis, a beautifully gentle image for something that was, in practical terms, a large-scale geological event driven by seasonal rainfall in the mountains of eastern Africa, thousands of miles to the south. What makes this fascinating is not that the Egyptians misunderstood the flood, but that they understood its timing with extraordinary accuracy, using only their eyes and their accumulated knowledge of the sky. The poetry and the practicality were not in conflict. They were the same thing, expressed in different languages. Beyond the stars, the Egyptians developed a more immediate way of measuring the flood. Nilometers. These were structures built into the riverbank or into the walls of islands and harbors, essentially measuring devices that allowed officials and priests to read the current level of the Nile with precision. Some were simple graduated columns or stepped staircases descending into the water, marked at regular intervals so that the height of the river could be read at a glance. Others were more elaborate, with carved inscriptions and channels that allowed water to flow into a measuring chamber where the level could be observed calmly, away from the movement of the current. The reading of a nilometer was not simply a technical exercise. It was information of enormous consequence. A flood that rose too low meant insufficient water for irrigation, poor soil renewal, and the very real possibility of failed harvests and hunger. A flood that rose too high could be equally destructive, carrying away the mud brick structures that sat too close to the bank, depositing too much sand and debris, and disrupting the careful systems of channels and embankments that farmers had built over years of patient work. A good flood, the right flood, arriving at the right level and receding at the right pace, was one of the greatest blessings that Egyptian life had to offer. And the people who watched for it, measured it, and announced its quality held a kind of power that was entirely their own. One can almost imagine the feeling in a riverside village when the news came that the flood was beginning well. Not a celebration exactly, not yet. Not until the water reached and held the right level and the retreat began on schedule. But a quiet loosening of something, a collective exhale, shoulders settling, faces turning toward the water with something softer than worry. The river was coming. Everything was going to be as it should be. That assurance arriving on the same schedule, year after year, generation after generation, was the foundation on which all of ancient Egypt was built. Not stone, not gold, not military power. The rhythm of water and soil and season repeated so reliably across so many centuries that it became, for the people who lived within it, simply the way the world worked. There is something quietly wondrous about that. A civilization born not from conquest or accident, but from a river's dependable generosity. A culture shaped, at its very core, by the ancient and patient practice of watching, and waiting, and trusting that the water would return. The sun had not yet risen, but the village was already beginning to wake. It happened the same way every morning, in the same gentle sequence, in the same order of sounds and movements and smells that it had happened the morning before. And the morning before that, going back through seasons and years and generations, until the pattern itself had become a kind of landscape as familiar and as unremarkable as the river running past the edge of the fields, or the desert cliffs standing pale and steady on the horizon. First came the birds. Before the sky had fully lightened, while it was still that particular deep blue that exists between true darkness and the first suggestion of dawn, the birds along the riverbank began. Herons calling from the reeds, geese somewhere further off, moving on the water, small sparrows and starlings stirring in the palm trees that grew in clusters near the houses, shaking their feathers and beginning the quiet, restless movement that preceded full song. The village had no need of any other alarm. Then came the sound of grain. In the courtyards and small rooms of the mud brick homes that made up the village, women were already at work with stone grinding tools, processing the grain that had been stored in clay jars and woven baskets since the last harvest. The sound of stone moving against stone had a particular rhythm to it, steady, circular, unhurried. It was one of the most constant sounds in an Egyptian village morning, and it had been heard in settlements along the Nile for thousands of years before the pyramids were built. And it would continue to be heard long after the last pharaoh had gone. The grain being ground was most often emmer wheat or barley. These were the foundational crops of Egyptian agriculture, grown in the black soil beside the river and harvested in large quantities each year. Ground into flour, they became the basis of bread, the central food of Egyptian daily life. Bread of many kinds, in many shapes, baked in clay ovens that stood in the courtyards of homes and in the larger communal areas of villages. Thick loaves, flat loaves, small round loaves, loaves flavored with honey or coriander or fenugreek, when such things were available. Bread was not a luxury. It was the substance of survival, eaten at every meal, carried by workers in the fields, offered to the gods in the temples, and placed in tombs to accompany the dead on their journey. Alongside the bread, and almost equally important, was beer. Egyptian beer was not quite what the word might suggest to a modern listener. It was thick, nutritious, mildly fermented, and more closely related to liquid bread than to the clear, cold drink familiar today. It was made from fermented grain, sometimes flavored with dates or other additions, and it was consumed by virtually everyone: men, women, children, laborers, scribes, priests, and nobles alike. Workers building the great monuments at Giza were recorded as receiving rations of bread and beer as part of their daily compensation. Beer was, in a very real sense, a food as much as a drink, and the smell of it fermenting in large clay vessels was as ordinary a part of village life as the smell of the river in the morning. As the sky brightened toward the east, the village began to fill with movement. The homes themselves were simple and sensible. Most ordinary Egyptian houses were built from mud brick bricks made from the abundant Nile clay, mixed with chopped straw for binding, pressed into rectangular molds, and left to dry in the sun. Sun-dried mud brick was not a poor or inadequate building material. It was well suited to the Egyptian climate. Thick walls kept interiors cool during the day and retained warmth through the cool desert nights. Homes were typically modest in size, arranged around a central room or courtyard, with smaller rooms for sleeping and storage opening off the main space. Rooftops were important. In the heat of Egyptian summers, sleeping on the flat rooftop under the open sky was common, and the roof often served as an additional living and working space during the cooler hours of morning and evening. A family sitting on a rooftop at dusk, watching the last light move off the river and the first stars appear above the desert, was as ordinary a scene as any in Egyptian daily life. The courtyard, where there was one, was the heart of household activity. This was where the clay oven stood, where grain was ground and bread was shaped and baked, where children played and chickens moved between people's feet, where jars of water and oil and stored grain stood against the walls, and where the family donkey, if the family owned one, was tethered in the shade. Donkeys were essential. It is difficult to overstate the role of the donkey in ancient Egyptian life. They carried loads that would have been impossible to move otherwise: grain, pottery, firewood, stone, building materials, goods for market. They worked the threshing floors, walking in circles over cut grain to separate the kernels from the stalks. They pulled plows, though oxen were preferred for the heavier work of breaking new soil. A family that owned a healthy donkey was a family with a genuine economic advantage, and the loss of a working animal to illness or injury was a serious matter. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon, the fields were alive. Farmers moved out from the village with their tools, simple wooden hoes and mattocks, with stone or bronze blades, digging sticks, baskets for carrying soil or harvested grain. The work of an Egyptian farmer varied by season, but there was rarely a time when there was nothing to be done. Irrigation channels needed clearing and maintaining. Embankments needed repairing after the flood. Seedlings needed tending. Mature crops needed harvesting, threshing, winnowing, and carrying to storage. Animals needed feeding and managing. Children were not idle observers of this world. From a young age, children in farming families participated in the work of survival, scaring birds from ripening grain fields, carrying water, feeding animals, helping with lighter harvest tasks. It was a life that asked a great deal of everyone in it, and offered in return the straightforward rewards of food, shelter, community, and the deep familiarity of a world that did not change very quickly. There were pleasures too, of course. The Nile itself was one of them. Children swam in its shallower channels during the warm months. Fishermen worked its surface in small papyrus boats, using nets and lines and simple traps. And a good day's fishing was both a practical contribution to the household and something that seems, from the paintings and carvings left behind, to have been genuinely enjoyed. Images of fishing and fowling, of men standing in papyrus skiffs with throwing sticks raised, of children reaching into the reeds, of herons and fish rendered in careful, affectionate detail appear again and again in Egyptian tomb paintings, suggesting that these activities held a warmth and pleasure in memory beyond their purely economic value. It is worth pausing here to consider what most Egyptians actually were. Not pharaohs, not priests, not architects or generals or scribes. The overwhelming majority of people who lived in the Nile Valley across those 3,000 years of Egyptian history were farmers. People who woke before sunrise to the sound of birds and grinding rain, who spent their days in fields and beside irrigation channels, who returned in the evening to mud brick homes and courtyards and rooftops, who ate bread and drank beer and watched their children grow, who knew the flood cycle as intimately as their own heartbeat, and who understood the world primarily through the rhythm of soil and water and season. Their names were rarely recorded. Their individual stories did not make it into the histories that later civilizations compiled, but their presence is everywhere in the surviving evidence in tomb paintings that show them at work, with the care and attention that suggests genuine affection for the subject. In the tools and household objects found in excavations, in the administrative records that counted their grain and measured their labor, and in the landscape itself, shaped by thousands of years of careful, patient agricultural work. As the afternoon heat settled over the village, the pace of outdoor work slowed. Animals rested in whatever shade could be found. People retreated to the cooler interiors of their homes for the middle hours of the day, the way people in hot climates have always done. The river moved past in the heat shimmer, wide and quiet and indifferent to the hour. And then, as the sun began to descend toward the western desert and the air cooled, the village came back to life. Evening meals were prepared, families gathered. The smell of bread baking mixed with the smell of the river, and the particular dusty warmth of sun heated mud brick, slowly releasing the day's heat into the cooling air. Somewhere, a child was being called in from the riverbank. Somewhere, a man was washing his hands and face in a clay basin of water after the day's work. Somewhere, an older woman was sitting in the last of the sunlight in a courtyard, her hands still moving with some small task, watching the sky above the palm trees shift toward the colors of evening. It is a gentle reminder that the great monuments of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the painted tombs were built within a world that was, for most people who lived in it, a world of very ordinary and very human things, of morning grain and evening bread, of children and animals and the river's edge, of sunlight and shade and the reliable return of the flood. The extraordinary and the everyday existed together, side by side, along the same narrow ribbon of green beside the Nile. And both of them, in their different ways, were ancient Egypt. Long before the pyramids, long before the great temples with their painted columns and their carved processions of gods and kings, long before the scribes copied their careful signs onto papyrus in lamplit rooms, and long before the pharaohs wore their double crowns and their ceremonial beards, and were carried through cheering crowds on gilded chairs, long before all of that, there were simply people beside a river, small groups at first, families and clusters of families moving through a landscape that was, in those earliest centuries, still finding its final shape. The Sahara, which today is one of the driest places on Earth, was not always as it is now. In a period that geologists and archaeologists refer to as the African humid period, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era, much of what is now desert received significantly more rainfall. There were lakes and wetlands in places that are now empty sand. There was grass. There were animals grazing across a landscape that looked, in some areas, more like savanna than desert. As that wetter period gradually ended and the climate dried, people moved. They followed the retreating water, and many of them followed it to the most reliable water source in the region, the Nile. This movement was not sudden. It was the slow drift of generations, families shifting their seasonal routes year by year, decade by decade, until the river valley became not just a place they visited, but a place they stayed. And in staying, they began to do what people who stay in one place always eventually do. They built, they planted, they kept animals, they organized. Communities formed along the valley and in the delta. By around 5,000 years before the Common Era, there were settled agricultural villages scattered along the Nile. People who were already developing the skills and habits that would, over the following centuries, become the foundation of one of the ancient world's most enduring civilizations. They made pottery. They buried their dead with care, placing objects beside them in graves tools, beads, food, in ways that suggest an already developed belief in some form of life beyond this one. They were not yet Egyptian in the sense that we use the word, but they were becoming Egyptian, slowly, in the way that all peoples gradually become themselves. Over the centuries that followed, the settlements of the Nile Valley grew larger and more organized. Trade between communities increased. Certain settlements became more influential than others, perhaps because of their location on the river, their access to particular resources, or simply the accumulated authority of successive capable leaders. Hierarchies developed, specialized roles emerged. Some people farmed, some people made pottery or jewelry or tools, some people organized and administered and eventually ruled. By around 3,100 years before the Common Era, something had crystallized. The Nile Valley contained two distinct political regions: the South Upper Egypt, with its narrow valley and its strong consolidated communities, and the North Lower Egypt, with its wide delta and its more diffuse marshy landscape. These two regions had developed somewhat differently, with their own local traditions, their own emblems and symbols, their own ways of organizing power. The South was associated with the white crown, a tall, smooth, egg-shaped ceremonial headpiece. The North with the red crown, a flat-topped structure with a distinctive curling projection at the back. The unification of these two regions into a single kingdom is one of the foundational moments of Egyptian history. And, like many foundational moments, it exists somewhere between documented fact and living myth. The figure most closely associated with this unification is a king known as Narmer. Narmer may or may not have been the very first ruler of a unified Egypt. Historians continue to discuss the precise details, and the boundary between the last pre-unification rulers and the first rulers of a united kingdom is not entirely clear from the surviving evidence. But Narmer's name is the one that has come down to us most vividly, preserved on a remarkable object discovered in the late 19th century near the ancient city of Hieroglyphs in southern Egypt. This object is a carved ceremonial palette, a flat, shield-shaped piece of greenish siltstone, about 60 centimeters tall, decorated on both sides with carved images. On one side, a large figure wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt raises a mace above a kneeling captive. On the other side, the same large figure, now wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, walks in procession. Both crowns, one ruler. The Narmer palette, as it is known today, is one of the earliest historical documents in existence. It is not a straightforward record of events in the way a modern document might be. It is ceremonial, symbolic, designed to communicate authority and cosmic order rather than to report the specific details of a military campaign. But it tells us something enormously important, that by the time it was made, someone was already thinking about Egypt as a unified whole, and expressing that unity through the image of a single king wearing the emblems of both lands. Whether the unification happened through gradual political consolidation, through military conquest, through strategic marriage, or through some combination of all of these, is something that the surviving evidence does not tell us with complete clarity. What it does tell us is that the unification happened, and that it was understood from very early on as one of the defining facts of Egyptian civilization. The two lands were one, and the king who held them together held something of enormous significance. This brings us to a concept that is, in many ways, more important than any individual ruler or any single political event, a concept that ran through every aspect of Egyptian life, from the behavior of the pharaoh to the arrangement of a farmer's field, from the rituals of the temple to the decorations painted on the walls of an ordinary home. The Egyptians called it Ma'at. Ma'at is a word that resists easy translation because it refers to something more than any single English word can capture. It is sometimes translated as truth, sometimes as justice, sometimes as order, sometimes as harmony, sometimes as balance. But none of these translations individually quite contains it. Ma'at was all of these things simultaneously, and it was also something more fundamental than any of them. Ma'at was the proper state of the universe. It was the way things were supposed to be when everything was working correctly. It was the flood arriving at the right time and the right level. It was the sun rising each morning and setting each evening. It was the stars following their fixed paths. It was the king ruling wisely, the fields producing their grain, the temples receiving their offerings, and the dead being properly honored. It was balanced not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in the immediate practical sense of a world in which every part was doing what it was supposed to do in relation to every other part. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, the condition in which the flood did not come, or came too violently, or in which the king failed in his duties, or in which the sacred rituals were neglected and the relationship between the human world and the divine world began to fray. The pharaoh's primary responsibility was to maintain Ma'at, not simply to rule in the political sense, to make laws and command armies and collect taxes, but to actively sustain the order of the world through right action, proper ritual, and the correct fulfillment of the role that the gods had assigned to kingship. This idea connected everything. It connected the king to the farmer, because the king's maintenance of Ma'at ensured that the flood would come and the fields would produce. It connected the priest to the god, because the temple rituals sustained the divine order that made Ma'at possible. It connected the living to the dead, because proper burial and remembrance were part of the same ordered world in which everything had its place and its purpose. Ma'at was the river, and the field, and the temple, and the tomb, and the household, and the star above the eastern horizon at dawn, all understood as parts of a single interconnected order, that it was the responsibility of every person, in their own way and in their own place, to support and sustain. It is a quietly beautiful idea, and it is, in a very real sense, the idea at the heart of ancient Egypt, more durable than any individual ruler, more encompassing than any single monument, and more intimate than any grand political event. The two lands had become one, and the thread that held them together was not force alone, but the shared understanding of a world that worked best when everything within it was in its proper place. The flood had come and gone. It had done what it always did, risen slowly and generously across the fields, spread its shallow brown water over the black soil of the valley, held for its appointed weeks, and then retreated as quietly as it had arrived, leaving the land dark and damp and ready. The channels were full. The embankments had held. The nilometer reading had been favorable, and now, in the weeks following the water's retreat, the farming year had begun in earnest. A family living in a village somewhere in the middle of the Nile Valley would have felt this moment as a kind of collective exhale. The waiting was over. The work could begin. And work, in ancient Egypt, for the vast majority of the population, meant the work of the land. The father of this family, let us imagine him as a man in his middle years, lean from outdoor labor, with calloused hands and a face that had spent most of its life under the Egyptian sun, would have been out in the fields before the morning had fully warmed. He carried a simple wooden hoe, its blade shaped from a harder wood or fitted with a stone edge, worn smooth from years of use. Beside him, his eldest son, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, carried a bag of seed grain and a smaller hoe of his own. Behind them, their neighbor led a pair of oxen along the edge of the field, the animals moving with the patient, unhurried rhythm of creatures that understood their work. The plow they pulled was a simple instrument, a wooden frame with a pointed tip that cut a shallow furrow into the still damp soil. It was not designed to turn the earth deeply the way later agricultural plows in other parts of the world would do. The Nile flood had already done the most important preparation, loosening and enriching the soil in a way that made deep plowing unnecessary. What the Egyptian plow did was create the furrow into which the seed would be dropped and then lightly covered, either by hand or by driving a small flock of sheep or goats across the planted area, their hooves pressing the seeds into the soft earth as they walked. It was simple. It was ancient. And it worked. The seeds being pressed into the dark soil were most often emmer wheat or barley, the same grains that had sustained Egyptian life for thousands of years. Emmer wheat was particularly important. It was the grain from which most Egyptian bread was made, and bread was not simply a food. It was, in a very direct sense, the currency of daily survival. A household with full grain jars was a household that would eat through the dry months, a household whose grain had run short faced genuine hardship, and the community systems of storage and distribution that Egyptian villages developed over centuries were in part a collective response to that risk. Beyond wheat and barley, Egyptian farmers grew a variety of other crops depending on their location and the particular qualities of their fields. Flax was grown extensively not for food, but for its fibers, which were processed into linen thread and woven into cloth. Linen was Egypt's primary textile, worn by virtually everyone from the humblest farmer to the highest priest, and the fields of flax that produced it. With their small blue flowers nodding in the morning breeze, were as familiar a feature of the Egyptian agricultural landscape as the grain fields themselves. Vegetables grew in garden plots closer to the village and along the edges of the irrigation channels where water was most accessible. Onions, leeks, garlic, cucumbers, and lettuce were all common. The onion, in particular, seems to have been something close to a dietary staple. It appears frequently in lists of food rations issued to workers, and it turns up in tomb paintings and offerings with a regularity that suggests genuine affection. There is something quietly charming about the idea that one of the most enduring foods in Egyptian daily life was simply the humble onion. Legumes were grown alongside the grain. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans provided protein in a diet that was primarily plant-based for most ordinary people. Meat, particularly beef, was a luxury enjoyed mainly at festivals or by those with sufficient wealth to maintain cattle. Fish from the river was more accessible and more commonly eaten, along with waterfowl caught in the marshes and delta wetlands. A farming family's daily meals were substantial but simple bread, beer, onions, lentils, sometimes fish, sometimes a handful of dates or figs from the trees that grew near the village. The date palm deserves a particular mention. The date palm was not merely a food source in ancient Egypt. It was an architectural feature of the landscape, a shade provider, a calendar marker, and a source of materials for weaving and construction. Its fruit was eaten fresh when in season, dried for storage, or fermented into a sweet palm wine that occupied a place in Egyptian social life, somewhere between beer and a more formal luxury drink. The fronds of the palm were used in construction and basket making. The trunk, though not ideal for heavy building, served various practical purposes, and the simple visual presence of the date palm tall, graceful, its fronds catching the light, was so deeply embedded in Egyptian visual culture that it became an architectural motif. The column of certain Egyptian temples designed to evoke the shape of the palm trunk rising to its crown of leaves. Water, of course, was everything. The flood deposited moisture into the soil, and that moisture sustained the early growing season. But as the dry months progressed and the soil began to harden, additional irrigation was necessary, and this was managed through a network of channels, embankments, and lifting devices that Egyptian farmers had developed and refined over many centuries. The most characteristic of these lifting devices was the shataf. The shataf was an elegantly simple machine, a long wooden pole balanced on a pivot, with a weight on one end and a bucket or container on the other. A farmer operating a shataf would pull down the bucket end into a lower water source, a channel, a pool, a section of the river, fill the bucket, and then allow the counterweight to lift it, swinging the full bucket up and over to be emptied into a higher channel or directly onto the field. The motion was rhythmic and continuous, a steady up and down, repeated for hours at a stretch. The sound of a shataf working beside an irrigation channel, in the dry months the creak of the wooden pole, the splash of water, the quiet exhalation of the farmer at the end of each cycle, was one of the defining sounds of Egyptian agricultural life. Images of the shataf appear in tomb paintings and carved reliefs across many centuries, always in that same patient posture of repeated effort, one arm pulling down, the other guiding, the body moving in the ancient rhythm of water lifted from a lower place to a higher one. It is easy to picture a man working his shadoof alone in the middle of a dry afternoon, the sun high overhead, the field stretching out behind him in neat rows, the channel running quietly at his feet. Perhaps he works without thinking about it much, the way people perform tasks their bodies have learned so completely that the mind is free to wander. Perhaps he is thinking about his family, or the weather, or the condition of the grain now growing in the field behind him. Perhaps he is thinking about nothing at all, simply present in the rhythm of the work and the heat and the smell of the water and the damp earth. After the harvest came the granary. The granary was one of the most important structures in any Egyptian settlement. From the smallest village to the largest temple complex or royal estate, grain that was properly stored in sealed clay vessels or purpose-built storage chambers could last for years, a buffer against the uncertainty of future floods, a reserve against poor harvests, a resource that could be drawn upon in times of difficulty. Egyptian administrators were meticulous about their grain records. Scribes visited the harvest fields and the threshing floors, counting and measuring and writing down the quantities of grain being collected. The records they kept were administrative tools, but they were also, in a broader sense, instruments of social stability, the means by which a system of distribution could be maintained, ensuring that workers and craftspeople and priests and soldiers were fed even in years when the flood was less than ideal. The threshing floor itself was a social space as much as a working one. After the grain had been cut and bundled and carried from the fields, it was spread across a flat, hard-packed area and either walked over repeatedly by animals or beaten with wooden flails to separate the grain from the stalk. Then it was winnowed, tossed into the air with wide, flat baskets so that the wind could carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back into the pile. The work required many hands, and threshing floors seem, from the paintings and carvings that depict them, to have been places of collective labor, noise, dust, and a certain harvest time energy that even the calm conventions of Egyptian art could not entirely suppress. By the time the grain was stored and the fields were resting, waiting for the next flood, the farming year had described its full circle. The work had been hard, as it always was. The rewards were simple enough to eat, enough to store, enough to share with the temple and the state in the form of taxes and offerings and labor levies. But within those simple rewards was something more durable than abundance. A rhythm, a knowledge of the land and the water and the season that passed from parent to child across hundreds of generations. A quiet competence in the face of a world that was, most of the time, reliable enough to work with. The granaries were full. The river was moving past in the afternoon light, wide and unhurried. And somewhere on the edge of the village, a farmer was walking home through his field with the particular careful attention of someone reading soil, feeling the texture of it under his feet, noticing where it was drying too quickly, where it was holding moisture well, storing up observations that would shape his decisions next season and the season after. This was the foundation of everything, not the pyramids rising in the north, not the temples carved from living rock, not the gold in the royal tombs or the lapis lazuli on the temple walls. The foundation was this: dark soil, patient hands, and the steady turning of a world made reliable by water. The river carried everything. Goods, people, news, and ideas all moved along the Nile in the way that rivers everywhere have always carried the currents of human life slowly, reliably, and in both directions depending on the wind and the season. A merchant traveling north from the southern valley towns would have felt the current beneath his boat, assisting him, the river doing most of the work while he managed the steering oar and watched the banks slide past. A traveler heading south would have raised a simple sail to catch the prevailing northerly wind, which blew up the valley with enough consistency that Egyptian boats were designed from very early on to take advantage of it. The river moved north. The wind blew south. Between them, the entire length of Egypt was connected, and somewhere along that river, in the years following unification, a city began to grow. Memphis. The location made obvious sense to anyone who understood Egyptian geography. Memphis sat near the point where the narrow valley of Upper Egypt opened into the wide spread of the delta, the meeting place of the two lands, in a very literal geographical sense. A ruler based at Memphis could project authority both southward up the valley and northward into the delta. Trade coming from either direction passed through or near it. The administration of a unified kingdom needed a center, and Memphis, by geography and by the logic of the river, was the natural choice. By the time Memphis had been established as the primary royal residence and administrative capital of early dynastic Egypt, it was already becoming something more than a political center. It was becoming a place where the ambitions of a new kind of society were beginning to take physical form. Craftspeople, administrators, priests, merchants, and laborers gathered where power gathered, as they always do. Workshops producing fine objects in stone and metal and faience clustered near the royal precincts. Temple buildings rose beside the river. Mud-brick walls enclosed increasingly elaborate compounds. A merchant arriving at Memphis by river in those early centuries would have stepped off his boat onto a busy landing place. The smell of the river would have given way to the smells of a working city animals, food stalls, baking bread, wood smoke, the particular warm smell of freshly worked stone or wet clay from a nearby workshop. People moved with purpose along the paths between buildings. Officials in white linen passed with scribes attending them. Workers carried loads on their shoulders or balanced on wooden frames. Donkeys moved in patient lines along the wider thoroughfares. It was a city in the earliest sense of the word, a concentration of people and activity and specialization that could only exist because the agricultural world surrounding it was productive enough to feed people who were not themselves farming. And from Memphis, one's eyes would eventually have been drawn westward. Across the river, beyond the cultivated land, where the desert began and the limestone plateau rose above the valley floor, a different kind of human ambition was taking shape. Saqqara, the plateau above the western bank near Memphis, was the site chosen for the royal necropolis of the early Egyptian state, the place where kings and high officials were buried in tombs that grew more elaborate with each generation. From the earliest mud-brick mastaba tombs of the first dynasty, low rectangular structures covering burial chambers cut into the rock below. The trajectory of Egyptian funerary architecture was already moving in one direction. Upward, the step that changed everything came during the reign of a king named Djoser, who ruled during what Egyptologists call the Third Dynasty, roughly 27 centuries before the Common Era. Djoser's chief official, his vizier, the highest administrative position in the kingdom, was a man named Imhotep. Imhotep is one of the very few non-royal individuals from the ancient world whose name has survived not merely in administrative records, but in genuine cultural memory. He was, by the evidence available to us, an architect, a physician, a scribe, and an administrator of extraordinary capability. In the centuries and millennia following his death, his reputation grew to such proportions that he was eventually elevated to the status of a god, one of only a small number of historical human beings to receive this distinction in Egyptian religious tradition. Temples were dedicated to him. Pilgrims sought his intercession for healing. His image was carved, and his name was invoked across more than 2,000 years of Egyptian history. But in his own lifetime, what Imhotep did was something more immediate and more remarkable than any later legend. He built upward in stone. The structure that Imhotep designed for Djoser's burial at Saqqara began in concept as a mastaba, the traditional flat-topped rectangular tomb form. But then something changed. Additional rectangular structures were added on top of the first, each one slightly smaller than the one below, creating a series of diminishing platforms rising one above another toward the sky. The result was the step pyramid of Djoser, the first large structure in human history to be built entirely from cut stone, and the first monument in Egypt to reach, quite literally, toward the heavens. Standing at a distance on the desert plateau, looking at the step pyramid for the first time, a person from that era would have seen something for which there was no precedent. Everything built before had been low. Everything before had been made from mud brick or wood or simple undressed stone. This was different. This was a mountain made by human hands, 6 stepped levels, rising to a height of more than 60 meters above the desert floor, its limestone surface gleaming white in the Egyptian sun. One can almost imagine the feeling of that first encounter. Not the stunned disbelief of someone seeing something truly impossible, but something quieter than that. A kind of awe that settles slowly, the way large things always impress themselves gradually rather than all at once. The pyramid was too large to take in quickly. It had to be absorbed over time, walked around, considered from different distances and different angles before its full scale became real. Around the step pyramid, Imhotep designed an entire complex of ceremonial courtyards, chapels, and enclosure wall structures intended not for the living, but for the eternal use of the dead king in his afterlife. The complex was built in stone, but designed to imitate the forms of earlier mud brick and wood construction, as if the builders were so accustomed to those materials that they translated them faithfully into the new medium. Right down to columns carved to resemble bundles of reeds and walls decorated to suggest the appearance of woven matting. There is something quietly touching about that detail. The first great stone monument in Egypt was, in a sense, a stone memory of all the mud brick and reed and wood that had come before it, the new medium preserving the shapes of the old world in a form that would outlast everything else. Imhotep's achievement at Saqqara did not simply produce one remarkable building. It established a direction. It demonstrated what was possible when the organizational capacity of the Egyptian state was combined with the ambition of individual genius and the willingness to work in an entirely new way. It opened a door through which the next generations of architects and rulers would walk with increasing confidence. The step pyramid stood on the desert plateau above Memphis, visible from the river and from the fields and from the paths that traders and travelers followed along the valley. It stood as a presence that everyone in the region would have been aware of, not intrusively, not overwhelmingly, but steadily, the way large permanent things become part of the background of a landscape, and yet never quite stop being remarkable. Sailors on the Nile would have seen it from the water, its pale form rising above the palm trees of the western bank. Farmers in the fields would have glanced toward it without particular thought, in the way that people who live near something extraordinary gradually incorporate its presence into the ordinary texture of their days. Children growing up in the villages near Saqqara would have known it the way children know the hills or the river as simply part of the world they had been born into. And yet the step pyramid was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. From Saqqara, the story of stone and sky would move northward to a plateau above the Nile, where 3 kings of the 4th dynasty would attempt something even more ambitious, and where the results of that ambition would stand through flood and desert wind and the long passage of thousands of years until the present day. But that is a story for the section that follows. For now, it is enough to rest here on the limestone plateau above Memphis in the long shadow of the world's first great stone monument, and to consider what it meant that people had done this, that they had looked at the flat desert horizon and decided, without any example to follow, that something could rise above it. The scale of that decision, even now, is quietly astonishing. The road to Giza began with a mistake, or rather, with something that looked like a mistake at the time, and revealed itself only gradually as a necessary step in the long process of learning what was possible. After the step pyramid at Saqqara demonstrated that large stone structures could be built and could endure, the kings of the 4th dynasty turned their attention northward along the desert plateau, and their ambitions grew. The stepped form that Imhotep had pioneered was elegant and remarkable, but a new architectural idea was taking shape, the true pyramid, with smooth angled sides rising from a square base to a single point at the top. The The geometry was more demanding, the engineering was more complex, and the first serious attempt to achieve it produced something that, even today, communicates very clearly the difficulty of what was being attempted. The bent pyramid, built for the pharaoh Sneferu at Dashur, south of Saqqara, shows the adjustment happening in real time, preserved in stone for anyone patient enough to notice. The lower portion of the pyramid rises at one angle, and then, partway up, the angle changes, the sides become noticeably less steep, and the pyramid continues to its apex at this shallower gradient. The change was almost certainly made during construction, when it became apparent that the original angle was too aggressive for the internal structure to support safely. Rather than abandon the project, the builders adapted. They changed course. And the result is a pyramid that carries its own history written into its geometry, a monument that tells the story of people figuring something out as they went. Sneferu did not stop at the bent pyramid. He built again at a site nearby, and this time the angle was calculated more conservatively from the beginning. The red pyramid, named for the reddish color of its limestone core, rose smoothly and successfully to its apex. It was the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed, and it was built by the same king in the same reign as the bent pyramid. Sneferu was, by any measure, the greatest builder of his age, and possibly the greatest individual builder in the entire history of the pyramid building era, responsible for more pyramid mass than any other single pharaoh, including his far more famous son. That son was Khufu. And what Khufu built at Giza has not been surpassed, in certain specific ways, in the 4,500 years since its completion. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest of the 3 pyramids at Giza, and for most of recorded history the tallest structure ever built by human hands, was not constructed by slaves. This bears saying clearly and calmly, because the image of enslaved people dragging stones under the whip is one of the most persistent and most incorrect ideas associated with ancient Egypt. The people who built the pyramids at Giza were workers, skilled workers, organized workers, housed and fed and provided with medical care in a purpose-built settlement near the construction site. Archaeological excavations near Giza have revealed the remains of this workers' village in considerable detail. There were bakeries producing bread on an enormous scale, the kind of industrial bread production that could only exist to feed a very large workforce. There were breweries. There were butchers processing significant quantities of cattle, sheep, and goat. There were medical facilities where workers who were injured during construction received treatment, and the skeletal remains found in the associated cemetery show evidence of healed fractures and surgical procedures, suggesting that the medical care provided was genuine and reasonably effective. The workers who built the Great Pyramid were organized into crews with names teams that referred to themselves with titles like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure, names that suggest something of the group identity and perhaps even the humor of people engaged in hard communal labor over long periods. They were not anonymous. They had identities. They left graffiti inside the pyramid's internal chambers, brief inscriptions that were never intended to be seen by anyone after the tomb was sealed, but which survive today as the most direct human voices from the construction of the Great Pyramid. The logistics of the construction were staggering. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.5 million stone blocks, with an average weight of around 2.5 tons each, though some of the internal chambers are lined with blocks of granite weighing considerably more. The stone came from multiple sources, limestone from quarries very close to the site, which reduced the transport challenge considerably for the bulk of the material, and harder granite from Aswan, far to the south, which was used for the internal chambers and required transport by river over a distance of hundreds of miles. The Nile was essential to this. A harbor near the Giza plateau received boats carrying stone from distant quarries, supplies for the workers, and all the administrative and material support that a construction project of this scale required. Recent archaeological discoveries near Giza have found papyrus documents among the oldest papyrus documents ever discovered that record the logistical details of stone transport to the pyramid site. An official named Mirror kept a journal of his team's work, moving limestone blocks by boat from the quarries at Tura, on the opposite bank of the river, to the Giza harbor. His journal is a remarkable document, not dramatic, not ceremonial, not religious, simply a careful daily record of boats loaded, distances traveled, and blocks delivered. The bureaucracy of the ancient world, quietly preserved. The outer surface of the Great Pyramid, when it was completed, was covered in fine white Tura limestone casing stones, fitted together with extraordinary precision and polished to a smooth finish. In the Egyptian sun, the completed pyramid would have been brilliant, a gleaming white form rising from the desert plateau, visible from an enormous distance, catching and reflecting the light in a way that no structure around it could approach. Most of these casing stones were removed in later centuries, used as building material for other projects, which is why the pyramid today presents its stepped core rather than a smooth surface. But in Khufu's time, and for many centuries afterward, it stood white and sharp-edged against the blue Egyptian sky. Beside it, in time, rose two more pyramids, those of Khafre and Menkaure. The second and third of the Giza complex, along with smaller subsidiary pyramids, temples, causeways, and the elaborate funerary infrastructure that surrounded each royal burial place. The plateau became, over the course of the Fourth Dynasty, one of the most concentrated displays of architectural ambition in the ancient world. And then there is the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx of Giza sits at the eastern edge of the plateau, facing east toward the rising sun, carved from a single outcropping of natural limestone bedrock that the pyramid builders had left in place when they quarried the surrounding stone. It depicts a recumbent lion with a human head, almost certainly a portrait of the pharaoh Khafre, whose pyramid stands directly behind it. At its full original dimensions, the Sphinx was an enormous presence over 70 meters long and more than 20 meters tall, carved directly from the living rock of the plateau rather than assembled from separate blocks. What makes the Sphinx particularly interesting, in the quiet way that ancient things can be interesting, is its relationship with the sand. The desert is patient in ways that human beings are not. Almost from the time of its completion, the Sphinx began to be buried. Sand drifted against its base and accumulated around its body, until, over the centuries, the great stone lion disappeared up to its neck in the desert floor, leaving only the head and the upper portion of the shoulders visible above the surface. For long periods of Egyptian history, the Sphinx was more buried than visible, a head emerging from the sand with the patient expression of something waiting for the world to remember it was there. There is a story preserved in an inscription on a granite stele placed between the Sphinx's paws that a young prince named Thutmose, thousands of years after the Sphinx was built, fell asleep in the shadow of its enormous stone head while resting from a hunting expedition in the desert near Giza. In his dream, the Sphinx spoke to him, promising that if Thutmose cleared the sand from around its body, he would become king of Egypt. Thutmose did clear the sand, and he did become Pharaoh Thutmose IV, one of the rulers of the 18th dynasty. Whether the dream came first, or the clearing of the sand, or whether the story was shaped after the fact to give the act of restoration a sacred meaning, is something the stone cannot tell us. But the image it offers is a beautiful one, a young man asleep in the desert shade, the ancient stone face above him, the sand warm and still all around, and the quiet promise of something larger than any single life moving through the world while he slept. It is the kind of story that feels entirely at home in the Egyptian landscape, a world where the past was never entirely past, where old monuments carried living meaning, and where a dream beneath a buried stone lion could change the course of a life. The pyramids of Giza were the high point of pyramid construction in ancient Egypt, not the end of pyramid building, which continued in modified forms for many centuries, but the peak of ambition and scale that was never quite reached again. Later pyramids were smaller, built from less durable materials, and many have not survived as well as the great Giza monuments. But the three pyramids on the plateau endured. They endured the floods that came and went in the valley below them. They endured the desert winds that carried sand against their bases and wore at their surfaces over millennia. They endured the political changes and the invasions and the slow transformations that reshaped the world around them again and again across 4,500 years. They are still there now, standing on the same desert plateau where the workers' bakeries once produced bread by the thousands of loaves, where the harbor received its stone-laden boats from the south, where a young prince once slept in the shade of a buried lion and dreamed of becoming king. The scale of that endurance is, in every quiet sense of the word, remarkable. The wind came from the north. It almost always did in Egypt. A steady, reliable northerly breeze moving up the Nile Valley from the Mediterranean coast, following the corridor of the river as if the landscape itself had been designed to channel it. And in a sense, for the people who lived beside the river and depended on it for movement, the wind was as much a part of the Nile as the water itself. The current ran one way, the wind blew the other. Between them, the river was a road that worked in both directions, and the Egyptians understood this with the particular clarity of people for whom water transport was not a convenience, but a necessity. A boat moving northward on the Nile needed no sail. The current carried it, steady and patient, from the southern reaches of the valley down through the widening landscape toward the delta and the sea. A boat moving southward raised its sail, a simple rectangular sheet of woven linen or papyrus fiber mounted on a wooden mast, and allowed the northerly wind to push it upriver against the current. The symmetry was so reliable, so consistent across the seasons, that the Egyptians encoded it into their very language and their visual culture. The hieroglyphic sign for traveling north showed a boat with its sail down, moving with the current. The sign for traveling south showed a boat with its sail raised, moving with the wind. It is one of those small details that reveals, very quietly, how deeply the river had shaped the way these people thought about the world. A traveler setting out on the Nile in a well-made wooden boat would have experienced Egypt at the pace the river preferred, unhurried, observational, with time to notice the changing character of the banks as the journey progressed. In the southern valley, the cliffs would have been close and the landscape concentrated, the cultivated land a narrow green strip between rock and water. Moving northward, the valley would gradually widen, the cliffs pulling back, the fields expanding, the horizon opening. Villages appeared at intervals along the banks, their mud brick walls and palm trees reflected in the water. Herons stood in the shallows with the particular stillness of birds that have learned patience from the river itself. The boats that moved along this road came in many forms, suited to many purposes. The simplest and oldest were made from papyrus reeds bundles of the tall aquatic plant, lashed tightly together into a curved hull, light enough to be carried by one or two people. Shallow enough to navigate the delta channels and the marshy edges of the floodplain where wooden boats could not easily go. Papyrus boats were used for fishing and fowling, for crossing short distances, and for moving through the dense reed beds of the delta, with a speed and maneuverability that heavier craft could not match. A fisherman, standing in a papyrus skiff among the reeds, one hand holding a throwing stick and the other steadying the boat with a long pole, was a figure as characteristic of Egyptian river life as the farmer in his field or the scribe at his writing surface. For longer journeys and heavier loads, wooden boats were essential. And here Egypt faced a fundamental challenge. The Nile Valley, for all its agricultural abundance, was not well supplied with large timber. The trees that grew along the riverbanks and in the cultivated areas, acacias, sycamore figs, tamarisks, date palms, could provide wood for small objects, furniture, tool handles, and modest construction purposes. But they did not produce the long, straight, strong timbers needed for large sea-going or river-going vessels. Egypt's extraordinary civilization was built, in significant part, on trade, and one of the most important things it traded for was wood. Cedar was the most prized of imported timbers. It came from the forests of what is now Lebanon, from the mountain slopes above the Mediterranean coast, where cedar trees grew tall and straight and produced timber of exceptional quality and durability. Egyptian boats built from Lebanese cedar were strong, long-lived, and capable of carrying substantial loads. The trade routes that brought cedar to Egypt were ancient and well established, running either by sea along the Mediterranean coast or overland through the Sinai Peninsula, and the effort and expense of maintaining them tells us something important about how much Egyptian civilization depended on the world beyond its borders. The reach of Egyptian trade was, in fact, considerably wider than the geography of the Nile Valley might suggest. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue, semi-precious stone that appears in Egyptian jewelry, inlay work, and decorative objects across 3,000 years of history, did not come from anywhere near Egypt. It came from mines in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, in the mountains of the Badakhshan region, more than 4,000 kilometers from the Nile Valley. The lapis lazuli on an Egyptian amulet or in an Egyptian tomb had traveled an almost unimaginable distance before it arrived, passing through the hands of multiple intermediary traders, moving along routes that crossed deserts and mountains and river valleys, changing ownership many times before finally reaching an Egyptian workshop where it was cut and shaped and set into gold. The scale of that journey is astonishing, even by modern standards. In the ancient world, without mechanized transport, without maps of the kind we take for granted, without reliable communication across such distances, the movement of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to Egypt represents a trading network of extraordinary reach and sophistication. And it was not exceptional. Tin for bronze came from distant sources. Certain woods traveled vast distances, oils and resins from lands far to the south and east found their way into Egyptian temples and tombs. Egypt was not an isolated world, it was a connected one. The desert routes that led away from the Nile Valley in all directions were as important to this connectivity as the river itself. To the east, tracks through the eastern desert led to the Red Sea coast, where Egyptian ships could sail southward toward the land the Egyptians called Punt, a place associated with incense trees, exotic animals, gold, and ebony, whose precise location scholars continue to discuss, but which lay somewhere along the coast of eastern Africa or the Arabian Peninsula. Expeditions to Punt were recorded as significant royal achievements, the returning ships laden with myrrh trees, living animals, and quantities of aromatic resins that the temples required in vast amounts for their daily rituals. To the west, desert tracks led to the Oases, those pockets of water and cultivation in the Libyan desert that served as waypoints for travelers crossing the western reaches. The Oases were not simply watering stops. They were settled communities with their own agriculture and their own local character, connected to the valley by roads that experienced desert travelers could follow with confidence. To the north, the Mediterranean coast opened routes toward the Aegean world, toward Cyprus and Crete, and the trading centers of the eastern Mediterranean where Egyptian goods above all, grain were valued, and Egyptian cultural influence could be felt in the styles of pottery, jewelry, and architecture that show clear Egyptian inspiration across a wide geographic area. The sailors who navigated these routes were skilled and experienced. Reading the Nile required knowledge of its currents, its sandbanks, its seasonal variations, the places where the channel was deep, and the places where a loaded boat risked grounding. Reading the Mediterranean required knowledge of winds and stars, and the behavior of the sea in different seasons. Egyptian sailors did not have charts in the modern sense, but they had something equally valuable accumulated knowledge, passed from experienced sailors to their apprentices over generations, a mental map of the water built from countless voyages and encoded in memory and practice. A sailor settling in for a night watch on the river, the boat anchored near the bank while the crew slept, would have known the sky above him with the same intimacy that a farmer knew his fields. The stars that told him the season, the ones that told him his direction, the ones that told him how many hours remained until dawn. The particular silence of the Nile at night, the water moving past, the reeds shifting slightly in whatever breeze came off the desert. The distant call of a night bird. The smell of mud and water, and the faint smoke of the cooking fire that had been allowed to die down for sleeping. It was a life of movement in a world that was, in most other respects, defined by stillness and repetition. The sailors and traders who moved along the river and out into the wider world brought back not only goods, but ideas, images, and knowledge of other ways of doing things. The Egyptian world, rooted as it was in the black soil of the Nile Valley and the reliable rhythm of the flood, was nonetheless porous at its edges, receiving influences, sending influences outward, participating in a broader ancient world that was more interconnected than it is sometimes imagined to have been. The boats came and went with the seasons and the winds. Cedar timbers creaked gently as a loaded vessel settled in the current. Amphoras and storage jars were secured with rope in the hold. A sailor at the stern managed the steering oar with the casual ease of long practice, reading the water ahead for the slight darkening that indicated depth, the slight rippling that indicated shallows. Somewhere in the distance, the riverbank moved past in the afternoon light palm trees, fields, a village, a child watching from the edge of the water as the boat went by. The river carried everything, and along it, And beyond it, the world of ancient Egypt reached further than the desert horizon, further than the valley walls, further than the last palm tree on the edge of the cultivated land, out into a wider, older, more connected ancient world that was always present, just beyond the bend in the river. There is a particular quality to objects made slowly by hand, not the mechanical perfection of things produced in quantity, where every copy is identical to every other, and the process of making has been separated entirely from the thing made, but the quality that comes from a single pair of hands working with a specific material over a specific period of time, making small decisions at each stage. This much pressure, this angle, this depth of cut, this shade of color, so that the finished object carries within it, invisibly but permanently, the record of its own making. Ancient Egypt produced objects of this kind in extraordinary variety and extraordinary quantity across 3,000 years of continuous craft tradition. Not only the famous things, the golden funeral masks, the painted coffins, the carved stone statues that fill the world's great museums, but also the quieter things, the linen headrest, the faience bead, the small pottery jar that once held a household supply of coal, the woven basket left in a corner of a storeroom, the painted wooden comb, the clay lamp that burned oil through a long night while someone worked or slept or lay awake thinking. These things were made by people whose names are almost never recorded. Craftspeople working in workshops attached to temples, palaces, and wealthy estates, or in smaller independent operations in the villages and towns of the Nile Valley, who spent their working lives developing skills that were passed down within families and communities across generations. Their work was practical. It was also very often beautiful, and the combination of practicality and beauty in Egyptian craftsmanship is one of the most consistent and quietly remarkable features of the civilization. Begin, perhaps, at the edge of a marsh. The papyrus plant grew in dense stands along the banks of the Nile, and in the channels and lagoons of the delta, its tall green stalks rising several meters above the water surface, crowned with feathery brown flower heads that moved in the river breeze. For most casual observers, papyrus was simply a feature of the landscape, a wall of green at the water's edge, home to birds and fish and the small creatures of the riverbank. But for Egyptian craftspeople, it was a raw material of extraordinary versatility. The most famous use of papyrus, and the one that would eventually give our own word paper its origin, was as a writing surface. The process of making papyrus sheets was careful and labor-intensive. The thick green stalks were cut, and the outer rind removed, revealing the white, pithy interior. This interior was then sliced into thin strips, which were laid out in overlapping layers, one layer running horizontally, another vertically on top, and then pressed firmly together under weight. The natural sugars in the papyrus acted as a mild adhesive, and as the layers dried under pressure, they bonded into a flat, smooth, durable sheet that could receive ink cleanly and could be rolled and stored and carried with relative ease. Individual sheets could be joined end to end to create scrolls of considerable length. A long administrative document, a literary text, a collection of religious hymns or medical instructions, these were all recorded on papyrus scrolls that could be stored in ceramic jars or wooden boxes, carried across the country in leather satchels, and consulted years or decades after they were written. The oldest surviving papyrus documents from Egypt include administrative records, religious texts, medical guides, and personal letters a range that tells us something important about who was writing and what they considered worth preserving. Papyrus was not cheap, and it was not casually used. A scribe preparing to write on a fresh sheet was working with a material that had real value. And the care that went into the production of Egyptian papyrus documents, the neat columns, the careful spacing, the occasional use of red ink to mark headings or important passages reflects that awareness. But papyrus was also used for much more mundane purposes. Sandals were made from woven papyrus fiber light, comfortable in the heat, and easily replaced when they wore out. Baskets and mats were woven from papyrus. Rope was twisted from its fibers. And the papyrus plant itself, particularly its young shoots, was eaten a food source available seasonally along every stretch of the Nile. From the marshes, move now to the fields of flax. Flax was one of the most important agricultural crops in ancient Egypt, not for food, though its seeds provided oil, but for its stem fibers, which were processed into linen thread and woven into the cloth that clothed virtually everyone in the Egyptian world. The fields of flax were harvested when the plants were still relatively young, and the fibers, most fine, pulled up by the roots rather than cut, to preserve the full length of the stem. The harvested stalks were then soaked in water to begin the process of retting, breaking down the outer plant material to free the long internal fibers, and then dried, beaten, and combed until the fibers could be drawn out into thread. The spinning and weaving of linen was primarily women's work in ancient Egypt, performed in households and in larger workshop settings. Spinners used simple hand spindles, a weighted stick that was set spinning and then allowed to drop, twisting the drawn fibers into thread as it descended. The thread was then woven on horizontal looms set close to the ground, the weaver sitting or kneeling before the frame and passing the weft thread back and forth through the warp with practiced, repetitive motions. Egyptian linen ranged from coarse practical cloth used for sacking and work garments to fabrics of extraordinary fineness, gossamer thin weaves, so delicate that ancient writers described them as woven air, fabrics through which the body was faintly visible and which caught the light in ways that heavier cloth could not. The finest linen was reserved for the wealthiest members of society and for temple use, where white linen garments were part of the ritual dress of priests and the clothing placed on divine statues. White was the preferred color for most Egyptian clothing, not because Egyptian craftspeople could not produce color they absolutely could, but because white linen was associated with purity, cleanliness, and the particular brightness that the Egyptian climate and the Egyptian aesthetic both seemed to prefer. A procession of priests in white linen moving through a temple courtyard in the morning light would have presented a visual impression of clarity and order that was entirely intentional. Color, when it was used with great intention. Egyptian craftspeople had access to a range of pigments that they applied to pottery, wall surfaces, wooden objects, and textiles with a skill developed over many centuries. Red came from red ochre, a natural iron oxide found in the desert. Yellow from yellow ochre. Black from carbon soot or charred organic material. White from calcite or gypsum. Green from a copper mineral called malachite, ground fine and mixed with a binder. And blue. Egyptian blue was one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient craft chemistry. It was a synthetic pigment, one of the earliest synthetic pigments ever produced, made by heating a carefully prepared mixture of silica, calcium, and a copper compound to very high temperatures. The result was a vivid, stable blue that could be ground into powder and used as paint, or fired into a glassy material and shaped into beads, vessels, and decorative inlays. This synthetic blue material, when used to coat objects, is what we call faience, a glassy, glazed ceramic that shimmers with color and light in a way that plain pottery cannot approach. Egyptian faience objects range from tiny beads and amulets to elaborate vessels and tiles, all sharing that characteristic surface glow that ancient craftspeople achieved through careful control of the firing process. The color most associated with faience is the turquoise blue-green that appears in thousands of Egyptian objects, a color that the Egyptians associated with fertility, renewal, and the life-giving quality of the Nile itself. A workshop producing faience would have been a place of carefully managed heat and carefully measured materials. Craftspeople who understood the chemistry of the process not in theoretical terms but in the practical language of observation and experience, knowing by the color of the flame or the smell of the kiln or the feel of the material at a certain stage that the process was proceeding correctly or needed adjustment. Alongside faience and pigment, Egyptian craftspeople worked with cosmetics and personal adornment in ways that speak to a culture with a genuine appreciation for the pleasures of personal appearance. Kohl, a dark powder made from ground galena or other dark minerals, was used to line the eyes, not purely for beauty, though it was certainly considered beautiful. The dark outline around the eye reduced glare in the intense Egyptian sun, offered some protection against eye infections, and created the characteristic elongated eye shape that appears so consistently in Egyptian painting and sculpture that it has become one of the most recognizable visual signatures of the civilization. Men and women both wore kohl. It was applied with small sticks of wood or bone, kept in little tubes or pots of stone, ceramic, or glass. Scented oils and perfumes were similarly widespread. In a climate where the heat was constant and water for washing was not always immediately available, fragrant oils applied to the skin served both a practical and an aesthetic purpose. The Egyptians produced perfumed oils by infusing animal fats or vegetable oils with aromatic plant materials, flowers, resins, herbs, sometimes through simple maceration and sometimes through more elaborate processes. The resulting perfumed oils were stored in small alabaster or ceramic vessels of great delicacy, sealed with stoppers of clay or wood, and counted among the valued possessions of households at every level of society. There is something gently wonderful about finding, among the objects recovered from Egyptian tombs and storage rooms, the small everyday containers of cosmetics and oils that people used simply because they wanted to smell pleasant and feel well presented in the world. It is a detail that reaches across the centuries with surprising immediacy, a reminder that the people who made and used these things were not simply historical figures, but people with preferences, habits, and a perfectly ordinary human interest in how they appeared to others and to themselves. The craftspeople who produced all of these objects, the weavers, the faience workers, the pigment grinders, the perfume makers, the bead stringers, the coal pot carvers worked within traditions that were ancient even by Egyptian standards, and they passed those traditions forward, teacher to apprentice, parent to child, across centuries of continuous practice. Their finished objects outlived them by thousands of years. A linen bandage, a faience bead, a small alabaster jar still faintly scented after 4 millennia, a painted wooden comb found in a tomb, its teeth still intact, its surface still bearing the red, and black decoration applied by hands that last moved before the oldest living tree on Earth was a seedling. These objects survived not because anyone planned for them to survive, but simply because the materials were durable, and the desert was dry, and the tombs were sealed, and the sand was patient. And in surviving, they offer something that the great monuments, for all their scale, cannot quite provide in the same way. They offer the feeling of ordinary life, preserved, in small and quiet things. The feeling of a world that was not only ancient and extraordinary, but also familiar, a world of people who made beautiful, useful objects, who cared about how they looked, who kept their cosmetics in small stone pots and their grain in carefully labeled clay jars, and who went about their days in much the same spirit, if not the same circumstances, as people in every age have always done. The morning began before sunrise. In the darkness before the first light appeared above the eastern desert cliffs, a priest was already moving through the temple precinct, his white linen robe catching the faint starlight, his sandaled feet quiet on the stone pavement. He had bathed in the sacred lake that lay within the temple enclosure, a rectangular pool of still, dark water fed by channels connected to the Nile, its surface reflecting the last stars of the night. The bathing was not simply a matter of cleanliness, though cleanliness was part of it. It was a ritual preparation, a crossing from the ordinary world of daily life into the sacred world of the temple, a way of marking the boundary between the two and showing, through the act of washing, that what came next required a different quality of attention. The sacred lake was one of the defining features of the great Egyptian temples. These pools, still visible today at sites like Karnak, where the lake is large enough to row a small boat across, served multiple purposes within the temple's daily life. Priests bathed in them as part of their purification rituals. Water drawn from them was used in temple ceremonies. Sacred birds, particularly geese associated with the god Amun, were kept near them, and they held a cosmological significance as well, representing the primordial waters from which, in Egyptian creation mythology, the world had first emerged, a contained image of the beginning of everything, kept within the temple walls as a permanent reminder of creation's origin. As the priest completed his preparations and moved toward the inner sanctuary of the temple, the sky above the eastern wall was beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly. The stars were still visible, but their quality was changing the deep black of full night, shifting toward a darkness that carried within it the first suggestion of what was coming. In the sanctuary, oil lamps burned with small, steady flames, their light reflecting off the gold leaf that covered the surfaces of the innermost shrine, the wooden cabinet within which the cult statue of the god resided. The cult statue was the living heart of the temple, not a symbol, not a representation in the purely artistic sense, but understood as a genuine dwelling place of the divine, a physical form through which the god could be present in the world, could receive the attentions of the priests, could be sustained and honored and kept in right relationship with the human community that depended on divine goodwill for the regularity of the flood, the fertility of the fields, the stability of the kingdom, and the safety of all the ordinary lives lived in the world beyond the temple walls. Each morning, the senior priest, the one designated to perform the daily rite, would approach the shrine, break the clay seal that had been placed on it the previous evening, and draw back the wooden doors. Inside, in the lamplight, was the statue, small in some temples and larger in others, made from wood or stone or metal, according to the wealth and tradition of the particular temple, dressed in fine linen, adorned with jewelry, anointed with oil. The priest would bow. He would speak the ritual words that announced the morning words that had been spoken in this form, in this place, or in temples very like it, for generations beyond easy counting. He would remove the statue's previous day's clothing and replace it with fresh linen. He would offer food and drink bread, beer, meat, vegetables, fruit, wine placed on offering tables before the shrine, in the understanding that the god's divine essence would receive the spiritual nourishment of the offerings, while the physical food could afterward be redistributed to the priests and temple workers. He would apply coal to the statue's eyes, anoint it with scented oil, and place before it small vessels of incense that filled the sanctuary with smoke, thick, sweet, resinous smoke that caught the lamplight and drifted slowly upward through the darkness of the inner chamber toward the ceiling, where painted stars covered the stone above in the colors of the night sky. Then the shrine doors were closed again, resealed, and the morning rite was complete. This ceremony, or one closely resembling it, was performed every morning in every major Egyptian temple across more than 3,000 years. The specific details varied from temple to temple and changed gradually across the centuries, but the essential pattern, purification, approach, offering, anointing, withdrawal remained remarkably consistent. It was one of the most durable ritual practices in the history of human religion. A morning ceremony performed so many thousands of times that it had worn grooves in the stone floors of sanctuaries and in the inherited memory of a priestly class that passed its knowledge from father to son, from teacher to student, in an unbroken chain. Beyond the inner sanctuary, the temple was a world in itself. The great temples of ancient Egypt above all the vast complex at Karnak, near the city of Thebes, which was expanded and elaborated by successive pharaohs across more than 1,000 years until it became the largest religious complex ever built, were not simply places of worship in the modern sense. They were not spaces that people entered primarily to pray or to seek personal spiritual experience. They were, in their fullest sense, sacred estates, enormous, walled, self-sufficient communities with their own economies, their own workforces, their own agricultural lands, their own granaries, their own workshops, and their own carefully maintained hierarchies of personnel. The priesthood of a major temple was a large and complex organization. At its highest levels were the high priests who performed the daily rituals and managed the theological traditions of the temple. Below them were ranks of priests with specific functions, those responsible for carrying the sacred bark during festival processions, those who managed the temple libraries and their collections of papyrus scrolls, those who performed the music of the rituals, those who managed the practical administration of the temple's considerable economic interests. But the temple also employed many people who were not priests in any formal religious sense. Scribes kept the administrative records, tracked the movement of goods in and out of temple storerooms, recorded the production of the temple's agricultural estates, and managed the complex accounting that a major religious institution required. Craftspeople worked in temple workshops, carpenters, metalworkers, weavers, painters, producing the objects and the textiles, and the maintenance work that kept the temple functioning. Farmers worked the temple's agricultural lands, which in the case of the great temples constituted enormous areas and produced the food that sustained the entire temple community as well as the offerings presented to the god each day. There were also bakers and brewers. The temple kitchens were substantial operations, producing bread and beer on a scale that corresponded to the size of the institution and the requirements of daily offerings, festival feasts, and the feeding of the temple's workforce. The smell of bread baking in clay ovens and of beer fermenting in large ceramic vessels was as much a part of the temple precinct as the smell of incense in the sanctuary. These were working places as well as sacred ones, and the sounds of a temple kitchen in the hours before dawn the movement of people, the sounds of grain being processed, fire being tended. Water being carried would have been entirely familiar and entirely domestic amid the more ceremonial sounds of ritual preparation happening simultaneously in the inner parts of the building. Walking through the public areas of a major temple would have been a journey through carefully managed experience. The entrance was typically through a massive gateway, a pylon, as Egyptologists call it. Two tapering rectangular towers flanking a central doorway, their surfaces covered in carved and painted reliefs showing the pharaoh in various poses of religious and military triumph. In front of these pylons, tall flagpoles carried bright pennants of colored cloth that moved in whatever wind came through the valley. The effect was dramatic, in the most understated Egyptian way, not violent or alarming, but simply very large and very confident. Beyond the pylon was an open courtyard, accessible to a wider public than the inner parts of the temple. Here, during festivals and certain designated occasions, ordinary people could approach closer to the divine presence than was possible on ordinary days. They could leave offerings, petitions written on small pieces of pottery or papyrus, requests for healing or assistance or guidance, placed at the feet of statues of gods and deified kings that stood along the processional ways. Further in, access became progressively more restricted. The hypostyle haul a forest of enormous stone columns, their surfaces covered from base to capital in carved and painted hieroglyphs and images, was dimmer and cooler than the open courtyard. The light filtering through small clerestory, openings high in the walls, and illuminating the painted columns in shifting patterns as the sun moved. Standing in a great hypostyle hall, surrounded by columns that dwarfed any human figure, in a half-darkness full of painted gods and kings and symbols and sacred text, would have produced an overwhelming impression of a world operating at a different scale from ordinary life, which was precisely the intention. Beyond the hypostyle hall, the rooms became progressively smaller and darker, the ceiling lower, the access more restricted, until the innermost sanctuary was reached, a small, dark, silent room where the lamplight flickered on the gilded shrine and the smoke of incense moved in the still air. The contrast was designed. The temple was a journey from the large and open human world into the small and dark and intimate space where the divine resided. Every architectural element, the narrowing of rooms, the lowering of ceilings, the increasing darkness, the thickening of walls was oriented toward that final arrival in the sanctuary, where the ordinary logic of scale and light and space had been deliberately reversed. Outside the sanctuary, outside the inner temple, outside the hypostyle hall and the courtyard and the great pylon, the life of the temple continued in its practical dimensions. Herds of cattle grazed on temple agricultural lands. Granaries stored the harvest of temple fields. Workshops produced the goods the temple needed. Scribes wrote in the temple offices. Priests bathed in the sacred lake as the stars went out and the sky began to lighten. And in the kitchen, bread was already baking. The smell of it moved through the morning air of the temple precinct, warm and entirely human, mixing with the faint drift of incense from the sanctuary and the clean smell of the sacred lake and the particular early morning smell of stone that has spent the night cooling in the desert air and is beginning, very slowly, to warm again. It is a gentle reminder that the temples of ancient Egypt were not cold or remote places, whatever their imposing architecture might suggest. They were communities, living, breathing, daily life communities of people who bathed and baked and wrote and prayed and argued about administrative matters and fell asleep at their posts on night watch and ground grain and repaired the temple's plumbing and worried about the harvest and looked after the sacred geese on the lake and came to work every morning in white linen and went home every evening to mud brick houses where children were waiting and bread was cooling on a flat stone near the oven. The divine and the domestic existed together in the Egyptian temple, as they existed together everywhere in the Egyptian world, not in conflict, but in the kind of easy, long-practiced companionship that comes from sharing a very small and very productive ribbon of green land beside a river for a very long time. The city was quieter than usual in the days before the festival. Not silent a city like Thebes was never truly silent, with its markets and its workshops and its river traffic and its thousands of daily lives proceeding in all their ordinary variety. But there was a particular quality to the quiet that settled over the city in the days of preparation, a collective gathering of attention. The way a community sometimes falls into a kind of shared anticipation that is felt rather than spoken. People moved through the streets with a slightly different quality of purpose. Temple workers carried additional supplies through the great gateways. Priests performed additional purification rituals at the sacred lake. Bakers worked through the night to produce the quantities of bread that would be needed. Garlands of flowers were prepared, and the smell of lotus blossoms and fresh greenery moved through the air of the city alongside the usual smells of the river and the market. The festival of Opet was coming. It was one of the most important festivals in the Egyptian religious calendar, celebrated at Thebes with particular elaboration during the period of the New Kingdom, when Thebes was at the height of its power and influence as the primary royal and religious capital of Egypt. The festival centered on the movement of the cult statue of the god Amun from his home temple at Karnak to the temple of Luxor, approximately 3 kilometers to the south along the bank of the Nile. This journey by river, or along the processional avenue that connected the two temples, was not simply a transfer of a religious object from one building to another. It was understood as a living event, a manifestation of divine presence moving through the world, and the people who lined the route to witness it were not passive observers, but participants in something that renewed the relationship between the divine and the human. The procession itself was a carefully choreographed movement of priests carrying the sacred bark, a model boat mounted on long carrying poles, within which the shrine of Amun rested, veiled from direct view along the avenue of sphinxes that connected Karnak to Luxor. Music accompanied the procession, the sound of sistrums, which were handheld rattles of metal that produced a dry, shimmering sound when shaken, and of drums, and of voices raised in hymns that had been sung at this festival for generations. Incense burners swung on chains, sending fragrant clouds drifting over the procession and the watching crowd. The crowd itself was part of the festival. Ordinary people lined the processional route with offerings of food and flowers. Acrobats and dancers performed along the margins of the procession. Street food was prepared and sold in quantities appropriate to a public celebration. Roasted meats, bread, fruit, beer flowing from jars set out in the shade of temporary canopies erected along the route. The festival lasted for weeks, and during that time the normally strict boundaries between the sacred world of the temple and the everyday world of the city became somewhat more permeable. People approached closer to the divine presence than was ordinarily possible. Petitions were presented. Oracles were sought the sacred bark itself. Responding through the movements of the priests carrying it was understood to be capable of answering yes or no to questions put to it. The Obit festival was, in this sense, a moment of contact, a time when the divine descended in a carefully managed way into the human world, and when the human world rose briefly toward the divine. But festivals were not the only way that the sacred moved through ordinary Egyptian life. The natural world itself was saturated with symbolic meaning in a way that required no special occasion and no formal ceremony. For a person living in the Nile Valley, the landscape was not simply a physical environment to be navigated and exploited. It was a world of signs and meanings, a living text in which the movement of birds, the behavior of animals, the appearance of particular plants, and the qualities of light and water and season all spoke to something beyond their immediate physical reality. The lotus was perhaps the most quietly pervasive of these symbols. The blue lotus and the white lotus grew in the shallows of the Nile and in the channels and pools of the delta, their flowers opening in the morning and closing at dusk, rising from the dark water on long stems, without any apparent connection to firm ground, rooted in the mud far below the surface. For the Egyptians, this daily cycle of opening and closing, of emergence from water and return to it, carried meanings that resonated deeply with their understanding of creation, of birth, and of the sun's own daily journey across the sky. The lotus was the flower of emergence. In certain Egyptian creation myths, the first dawn saw a great lotus rise from the primordial waters of chaos and open its petals to reveal the infant sun god, bringing light into a world that had known only darkness. The image was so compelling that it appeared everywhere, carved on column capitals, so that the columns of the hypostyle hall appeared to be a forest of lotus stems, painted in the hands of figures in tomb scenes, used as a motif on pottery, jewelry, headrests, and cosmetic containers, woven into the garlands that adorned festival participants and honored guests. A lotus flower, floating in a bowl of water in a domestic setting, carried all of this meaning effortlessly and without any need for explanation. Its presence was its meaning. The people who placed it there knew what it represented, in the same way that people know the meanings of the symbols they grow up among without needing to have them explained. Beside the lotus, the cat moved through Egyptian life with a particular combination of independence and domestic comfort. Cats were kept in Egyptian homes from at least the Middle Kingdom period, and possibly earlier, drawn initially to the grain stores that attracted the mice and rats that cats were so effective at controlling. But the relationship between Egyptians and cats seems to have moved quite quickly beyond pure utility into something warmer and more companionable. Tomb paintings show cats sitting beneath chairs during banquet scenes, gnawing on fish bones or playing with small objects, occupying the domestic space of the household with the casual confidence of animals that understand they are welcome. The cat was also sacred associated with the goddess Bastet, a deity of home, fertility, and protection, whose cult center at the delta city of Bubastis attracted pilgrims from across Egypt and beyond. Bastet was depicted as a woman with the head of a cat, or simply as a cat, and her association with the protective, nurturing, and fiercely maternal qualities of the domestic cat gave the animal a sacred dimension that sat comfortably alongside its everyday domestic presence. A cat sleeping in the sun in a courtyard was simply a cat. It was also, in a gentle and entirely Egyptian way, a reminder of something divine. The ibis moved through the Egyptian landscape with a different quality of presence, more formal, more associated with wisdom and learning, more connected to the scribal world of written knowledge that the Egyptians understood as one of the defining achievements of their civilization. The sacred ibis, a large wading bird with white plumage, a long, curved black bill, and black markings on its wings and tail, was associated with Thoth, the god of writing, knowledge, mathematics, and the moon. Thoth was depicted with the head of an ibis, and the bird itself was kept in large numbers at certain temples, particularly at Hermopolis in Middle Egypt, where mummified ibises were produced in extraordinary quantities as religious offerings. Archaeological excavations at ibis cult sites have revealed deposits of mummified birds numbering in the millions, a scale that communicates very clearly how deeply embedded the practice of sacred animal veneration was in Egyptian religious life. A traveler walking near the Nile in the morning might have seen ibises wading in the shallows, their long bills probing the mud for food. Their movements slow and deliberate in the way of large wading birds. They were entirely ordinary animals in the Egyptian landscape. They were also living manifestations of the divine, walking in the water at the edge of the cultivated world. The crocodile occupied a more complicated place in Egyptian symbolic life, feared and revered simultaneously, which is perhaps the most honest possible response to an animal that was genuinely dangerous and genuinely powerful. Crocodiles inhabited the Nile in large numbers in ancient times, particularly in the southern reaches of the river, and their ability to lie invisible beneath the water's surface and then move with sudden speed was something that anyone working near the riverbank understood as a real and present danger. The god Sobek was depicted with a crocodile head and was associated with the power of the Nile itself, with fertility, and with royal power. Temples dedicated to Sobek kept living sacred crocodiles in pools within the temple precinct, animals that were fed choice foods, adorned with jewelry on their forelegs, and treated with the reverence due to divine representatives. At the same time, Egyptians developed practical techniques for protecting themselves from crocodile attack, and the magical texts that survive include spells intended specifically to keep crocodiles away from fishermen and swimmers, and those working along the riverbank. The hippopotamus was similarly dual in its symbolic associations, a creature of enormous power and potential danger, associated in some contexts with the forces of chaos and disorder, and in others with the protective goddess Tauret, who was depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, and who was associated specifically with childbirth and the protection of women and children. Beyond the riverbank, the sky above Egypt was alive with birds. Enormous flocks of migratory birds passed through the Nile Valley twice each year, following their ancient routes between Europe and Africa. Herons, egrets, storks, swallows, swifts, and dozens of other species filled the Egyptian sky at the turning of the seasons, their movements marking the calendar as reliably as the stars. The falcon, above all, held a special place. Horus, one of the most central gods in the Egyptian pantheon, was depicted as a falcon or as a man with a falcon head, and the image of a falcon in flight, or of the distinctive eye of Horus, was one of the most widely used symbols in all of Egyptian art and religion. Beyond the symbols and the sacred animals, there was the sycamore tree. The sycamore fig grew in gardens, in temple precincts, and along the edges of cultivated land throughout the Nile Valley. It was a generous, shade-providing tree with a broad canopy and a thick trunk, producing edible fruit and offering relief from the Egyptian sun that was practical before it was symbolic. But the sycamore was also associated with the goddess Hathor and with the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead. In tomb paintings, a goddess emerging from a sycamore tree offers food and water to the souls of the recently deceased, the tree itself serving as the point of crossing between one state of being and another. One can almost picture the scene, the late afternoon shade beneath a sycamore in a temple garden, the leaves moving slightly in the river breeze, a cat sleeping in the roots, the sound of water from the sacred lake nearby, and somewhere in the middle distance, the sound of sistrums being practiced for the coming festival. Their dry, shimmering music drifting over the garden wall and fading into the warm Egyptian air. The natural world and the sacred world in ancient Egypt were not two separate things with a boundary between them. They were one continuous world in which a lotus flower and a waiting ibis and a sleeping cat and a sycamore tree in afternoon shade were all simultaneously exactly what they appeared to be, and also something more quiet presences in a landscape that had learned, over thousands of years of patient attention, to find meaning in everything the river gave. Power in ancient Egypt had a particular shape. It was not the shape that power takes in many other historical traditions, not primarily the shape of armies marching across plains, or of councils debating in formal chambers, or of competing factions maneuvering against one another in the corridors of palaces. Those things existed in Egypt, as they exist wherever human beings organize themselves into large and complex societies. But the shape that Egyptian power presented to the world, the shape it preferred for itself, the image it consistently chose to project across centuries of royal art and architecture and ceremony, was something more formal, more cosmic, and more deeply theatrical than simple political authority. The pharaoh was not merely a king. The pharaoh was, in Egyptian understanding, the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, son of Osiris, the rightful inheritor of divine kingship, and upon death, the pharaoh became Osiris himself, joining the cycle of divine renewal that connected the living and the dead, the earthly and the eternal. This was not simply religious language applied as decoration to a political institution. It was the actual framework through which Egyptian kingship was understood and experienced, both by those who exercised power and by those who lived within its reach. The pharaoh stood at the intersection of the human world and the divine world, and the ceremonies and symbols of kingship were designed to make that intersection visible. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt into a single composite headpiece, announced the unification of the two lands in the person of one ruler. The crook and the flail, held crossed over the chest in formal depictions, connected the king to the pastoral origins of Egyptian civilization and to the god Osiris. The false beard, tied to the chin with a cord, marked the wearer as divine even when the wearer was a woman. Which brings us to one of the most quietly remarkable figures in the entire long story of Egyptian kingship. Hatshepsut. She was born into the royal family during the early 18th dynasty, a period that Egyptologists consider the beginning of the New Kingdom, a time of renewed Egyptian power, expanding trade networks, and extraordinary artistic and architectural achievement. She was the daughter of the pharaoh Thutmose I, and she became the wife of his successor, Thutmose II. When Thutmose II died, the heir to the throne was a young boy, Thutmose III. Son of a secondary wife who was too young to rule independently. Hatshepsut initially served as regent, the senior royal figure managing the kingdom on behalf of the child king. And then, at some point in the early years of this arrangement, something shifted. Hatshepsut did not step aside as the young king grew older. Instead, she took on the full titles and regalia of pharaoh herself. She wore the double crown. She carried the crook and the flail. She adopted the formal false beard in her official depictions. She ruled Egypt not as a regent or a queen consort, but as pharaoh, as the living Horus, as the son of Ra, as the female king who maintained Ma'at and conducted the ceremonies and led the expeditions and commissioned the monuments that were the proper work of Egyptian kingship. Her reign lasted for roughly 20 years, and it was by any measure a successful one. One of the most celebrated achievements of Hatshepsut's reign was the expedition she sent to the land of Punt. Punt was a place that the Egyptians had been trading with for centuries, a distant land reached by sea from the Red Sea coast, from which Egypt obtained myrrh trees, frankincense, ebony, gold, and exotic animals. The expedition that Hatshepsut dispatched was recorded in remarkable detail on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, a temple that is, even in its current partially ruined state, one of the most beautiful architectural achievements in the ancient world. The carvings at Deir el-Bahari show the ships of the expedition arriving at Punt. The Egyptians trading with the local inhabitants, and the return journey with the ships loaded with myrrh trees planted in baskets of soil, their roots kept alive for the long voyage home, so that they could be transplanted into the gardens of Hatshepsut's temples. The care taken to transport living trees across the sea, the attention given to preserving their roots and keeping them watered during the voyage, speaks to something more than simple economic interest. There is a quality of genuine curiosity about the natural world in these carvings, a delight in the strangeness and abundance of distant places that feels entirely alive, even across the distance of 3,500 years. After Hatshepsut died, evidence of her reign was systematically removed from many of the monuments she had built. Her name was chiseled away from inscriptions. Her images were replaced with those of Thutmose III or left blank. The erasure was not total enough survived, including the remarkable Deir el-Bahari temple, to allow modern scholars to reconstruct her reign in considerable detail, but it was extensive enough to suggest deliberate intent. The reasons remain a matter of discussion among Egyptologists, and may have had more to do with the complex politics of succession and royal legitimacy than with any simple desire to erase a woman from history. What makes this fascinating is that the erasure ultimately failed. Hatshepsut's name and image survived, and her story, once rediscovered by modern scholarship, has become one of the most widely known in all of Egyptian history. The stone was more patient than the people who tried to edit it. From Hatshepsut, the story of Egyptian kingship moves through several generations to one of the strangest and most quietly absorbing episodes in the entire long history of the pharaohs. Akhenaten, he ruled during the 18th dynasty, several generations after Hatshepsut, at a time when Egypt was wealthy, powerful, and deeply embedded in the religious traditions centered on the great temples of Amun at Karnak and Luxor. And he changed almost everything very quickly in ways that the Egyptian world found deeply unsettling, and eventually reversed almost entirely after his death. Akhenaten's central act was the elevation of a single deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, to a position of supreme importance that effectively displaced the traditional Egyptian pantheon. This was not simply a religious preference. It was a wholesale reorganization of Egyptian religious, artistic, and political life around one central image and one central idea, that the sun disk, the Aten, was the source of all life and all goodness, and that the pharaoh Akhenaten was the sole intermediary between the Aten and humanity. To express this new vision, Akhenaten built an entirely new capital city. He chose a site on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt, a place where the desert cliffs curved back from the river to create a natural amphitheater of open ground that had never been settled and therefore carried no competing religious associations. He named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and today it is known as Amarna. The city was laid out along the river with remarkable speed, a planned urban center with temples open to the sky rather than enclosed in darkness, royal palaces, administrative buildings, and a residential area where the officials and craftspeople and workers who served the new capital established their households. The art produced at Amarna during Akhenaten's reign is unlike anything else in Egyptian history, where traditional Egyptian royal art presented the pharaoh as an idealized, timeless, formally perfect figure, broad-shouldered, slim-waisted, striding forward with the confident symmetry of a divine being. Amarna art presented Akhenaten and his family in a style that was deliberately softer, stranger, and more intimate. The royal family was shown in casual domestic moments, Akhenaten holding his daughters on his lap, the queen Nefertiti playing with the children, the family eating together under the rays of the Aten, each ray ending in a small human hand offering the Ankh symbol of life. There is something quietly moving about this art, whatever one makes of the religious and political upheaval that surrounded it. The image of a royal family rendered in a style that emphasizes their physical presence and their domestic warmth, the children climbing on their parents, the informal postures, the sense of genuine affection between the figures is unlike almost anything else the ancient world produced at this level of power. Whether it reflects the actual emotional life of Akhenaten's family, or is simply a new artistic convention in service of a new religious idea, is something the art cannot tell us with certainty. But the images endure, and they carry with them a quality of human warmth that is not easy to dismiss. Akhenaten's experiment did not outlast him. After his death, the traditional religious order was gradually restored. Amarna was abandoned, its buildings dismantled, and their stones reused in construction projects elsewhere. The name of Akhenaten was removed from royal records. His successors, including the young king Tutankhamun, whose name itself was changed from the Aten referencing form he had been given at Akhenaten's court to one honoring the restored god Amun, worked carefully to return Egypt to the religious and administrative norms that had governed it before. Yet the Amarna period left traces that could not be entirely erased in artistic conventions, in the softened naturalism that influenced Egyptian art for several generations afterward, in the administrative restructuring that Akhenaten's reorganization had necessitated. The period's influence persisted quietly beneath the surface of the restored traditional order. From Akhenaten and his intimate son-filled city, the story of Egyptian kingship moves eventually to the reign of a pharaoh whose name became across the centuries the most widely recognized in the entire Egyptian tradition. Ramses II, Ramses the Great, as later generations would call him, ruled Egypt for approximately 66 years, one of the longest reigns in the entire history of the ancient world. He built on a scale that was extraordinary even by Egyptian standards, adding to temples across the country, commissioning colossal statues of himself in numbers that left his image distributed across virtually every major sacred site in the kingdom, and conducting military campaigns in the Levant that resulted in one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in recorded history, the treaty between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, following the famously inconclusive Battle of Kadesh, a document that exists in copies in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Hittite cuneiform script. Ramses lived long enough to be known by several generations of Egyptians. He outlived many of his own children. His reign was so long that by its end, officials who had been born after his accession had themselves grown old in his service. The world changed around him while he remained a fixed point, enormous and enduring, like one of his own colossal statues. The diplomacy of his reign is, in some ways, as interesting as its monuments. The Hittite peace treaty was followed by a diplomatic marriage. Ramses eventually married a Hittite princess, receiving her at his court with considerable ceremony and incorporating her into the royal household in a way that formalized the peaceful relationship between the two great powers. Letters exchanged between the Egyptian and Hittite courts during this period survive, and they reveal a relationship conducted with careful attention to protocol, to the exchange of gifts, and to the maintenance of mutual dignity, the ancient equivalent of international diplomacy, conducted in the diplomatic language of the day. Power in ancient Egypt was, in the end, a thing of many textures. It was the formal ceremony of the morning temple ritual and the informal warmth of an Amarna family scene. It was the colossal statue of Ramses standing 60 feet high above the entrance to a temple, and the small, careful letters exchanged between courts conducting the patient work of keeping peace. It was Hatshepsut in her ceremonial beard, sending ships to punt and carving their return in stone, and Akhenaten in his open-air temple, lifting his hands toward the sun disk in a gesture of devotion that was, whatever else it was, entirely sincere. The shape of Egyptian power was large and formal and cosmic in its official presentation, but it was also, in its quieter moments, recognizably human. The lamp had been burning for some time. It was a small lamp, a shallow clay dish filled with oil, a wick of twisted linen floating in it, the flame no larger than a thumbnail but steady enough in the stillness of the room to cast a warm circle of light on the surface where a young man sat working. Outside, the city was quiet. The household around him had settled into sleep. But the young scribe had more to copy before morning, and so he sat with his back straight and his palette across his knees and his reed brush moving carefully, along the line of signs that his teacher had set for him to practice. He had been copying the same passage for 3 days, not because he was slow or because the passage was exceptionally long, but because the goal was not simply to reproduce the signs, but to internalize them, to know each one so thoroughly in its proportions and its relationship to the signs around it, that the hand could produce it correctly without the mind needing to pause and deliberate. A scribe whose hand hesitated was a scribe whose work was visible as practice rather than as mastery, and a scribe whose work looked like practice rather than mastery would not be trusted with the documents that mattered. The training of an Egyptian scribe was a long and demanding process that began in childhood and continued through early adulthood. Scribal schools known as the House of Life, when associated with temple institutions, or sometimes simply referred to in the sources as places where writing was taught accepted boys from families with the means and the connections to place them there. The ambitions of Egyptian parents on this subject were not subtle. Texts survive in which a father instructs his son with considerable passion on the subject of choosing the scribal profession over all others, enumerating the hardships of every other trade with relish before arriving at the scribe, whose work is done in the shade, who eats well, who is respected, who holds power without ever needing to lift anything heavier than a reed brush. The profession had its appeal, and its appeal was real. In a society where the administration of an entire kingdom, its agricultural output, its temple revenues, its military logistics, its legal records, its diplomatic correspondence, its religious literature, its medical knowledge was recorded and managed through writing, the people who could write held a particular kind of quiet power. Not the visible, ceremonial power of the pharaoh or the high priest, but the steady, indispensable power of the person who knows how the records are kept, who can read what others cannot, who translates the world into marks and marks back into meaning. A scribe working in the administrative offices of a major temple or a royal estate was, in a very practical sense, one of the people through whose hands the real work of governance passed. He counted the grain and recorded the count. He wrote the letters that went out from the palace and read the letters that came in. He copied the legal documents that established ownership and inheritance and contractual obligation. He recorded the names of workers and their wages, the inventories of storerooms, the accounts of expeditions, the measurements of agricultural land. Without the scribes, the Egyptian state could not have functioned. The writing system they used was one of the most distinctive ever developed, a system that combined phonetic elements with pictographic and ideographic ones in a way that took decades to master fully, and that was, in its most formal and beautiful form, a genuine visual art as well as a functional recording system. Hieroglyphs, the word comes from the Greek for sacred carved letters, were the formal monumental writing of ancient Egypt, used on temple and tomb walls, on royal inscriptions, on the surfaces of stelae and obelisks and coffins. Each hieroglyph was a carefully drawn picture, a bird, a human figure, a loaf of bread, a water jar, a mouth, an eye, a hand, and the signs operated on several levels simultaneously. Some represented sounds. Some represented whole words or concepts. Some were determinatives, signs placed at the end of a word to indicate its general category without contributing to its pronunciation. Reading hieroglyphs required knowing which level a given sign was operating on in a given context. And that knowledge came only from long study and practice. The formal hieroglyphic script, as it appears on the walls of Karnak or the interior of a royal tomb, is a remarkable thing to look at even without being able to read it. The signs are arranged with a compositional care that goes beyond mere information transfer, the spacing, the proportions. The relationship between signs and the images that accompany them all reflect an aesthetic sensibility that understood writing as a form of beauty as well as a form of communication. Alongside the formal hieroglyphic script, Egyptian scribes developed more cursive forms of writing for everyday use. Hieratic, a simplified, flowing version of the hieroglyphic signs. Written with a reed brush on papyrus was the standard administrative and literary script for most of Egyptian history, faster to write than the formal pictographic style, and better suited to the rapid production of documents, letters, and records. Later still, an even more abbreviated form called demotic developed, simplified to the point where its relationship to the original hieroglyphic signs is visible only to specialists. The scribal palette that a working scribe carried was a simple but essential tool. It was typically a long, narrow piece of wood or ivory with shallow, circular depressions at one end, one holding a cake of black ink, one holding a cake of red, and a long slot along its length for holding the reed brushes. Black ink was used for most text. Red ink was used for headings, important words, the beginnings of new sections, or the marking of inauspicious days in calendar texts. The scribal palette was the scribe's professional identity object. In the same way that a carpenter's tools or a farmer's hoe defined their profession, and scribes are frequently depicted in Egyptian art carrying their palettes under their arms or across their shoulders with the ease of long habit. The signs that a scribe spent years learning to make correctly were not simply functional marks. They were understood to carry power. In Egyptian religious thinking, the name of a thing was intimately connected to the thing itself. To speak a name was to invoke its reality. To write a name was to preserve it, to extend its existence beyond the moment, to give it a permanence that spoken sound could not provide. This is why the names of pharaohs and important individuals were written in cartouches, oval enclosures that surrounded and protected the royal name, and why the erasure of a name from a monument was understood as an act of genuine harm, an attempt to end the existence of the named person in a more than merely symbolic sense. The name was the person, and the written name was the person made permanent. This belief gave writing a sacred dimension that went beyond its administrative utility. To write correctly was to participate in the preservation of the world. The hieroglyphs carved on temple walls were not simply decorative or informative, they were active, performing the ceremonies and making the offerings they depicted through the very fact of being correctly written and placed in the correct context. A temple wall covered in hieroglyphs was not a wall with text on it. It was a wall performing an eternal ritual, independent of whether any human priest was present to act it out. The most intimate surviving examples of Egyptian writing are not found on temple walls or royal inscriptions. They are found on ostraka. Ostraka, the plural of ostrakon, from the Greek word for potsherd, are the broken pieces of limestone or pottery that Egyptians used as informal writing surfaces for notes, drafts, sketches, shopping lists, letters, administrative records, and all the kinds of quick, practical, everyday writing that did not merit the expense of papyrus. They were the scratch paper of the ancient world, and they survive in enormous numbers, particularly from the village of Deir el-Medina, the community of workers and craftspeople who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom. What the ostraka from Deir el-Medina preserve is something remarkable: the daily life of a working community in exceptional detail. There are work records noting which men were present at the tomb site each day and which were absent and why. There are notes recording deliveries of supplies: fish, grain, pottery, tools. There are records of disputes between neighbors, brought before the local council for resolution. There are love poems, written in a voice that is lyrical and personal and entirely human. There are complaints including, memorably, what appears to be among the first recorded labor disputes in history, when workers at Deir el-Medina stopped work and gathered at the mortuary temples on the West Bank to demand their overdue rations. A quiet demonstration of organized grievance that feels, across 3,500 years, surprisingly familiar. There are also jokes, brief, dry observations about work and colleagues and daily life, preserved on broken pottery with no expectation that anyone beyond the immediate recipient would ever read them. The people who wrote these notes had no idea they were writing for history. They were simply writing the way people write when writing is available and useful, and sometimes just a pleasure. This is one of the most extraordinary gifts that Egyptian literacy gives us. Not only the formal record of kings and temples and cosmic order, but the informal record of ordinary people going about their days, complaining about their supervisors, writing to their families, recording their shopping and their disputes and their private thoughts on whatever flat surface happened to be available. The Rosetta Stone deserves a quiet mention here, not as a dramatic discovery, but as a gentle resolution to a long silence. When Egyptian civilization ended and the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was gradually lost, the written record of 3,000 years of Egyptian life became inaccessible. The signs on the temple walls and the papyrus scrolls and the tomb inscriptions were visible to anyone who looked, but unreadable, a vast archive of human experience locked behind a system that no living person any longer knew how to decode. The Rosetta Stone, a granodiorite stele carved in 196 BC during the Ptolemaic period, bearing the same text in hieroglyphs, Demotic script, in ancient Greek, provided the key that eventually allowed scholars, most famously the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in 1822, to decode the hieroglyphic writing system. It was a patient unlocking, requiring years of careful comparative work, and when it came, it opened not a single door but an entire world, the accumulated written record of one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history, suddenly readable again after more than 1,000 years of silence. What that world said, once it could be heard again, was not only what the temple walls said, the formal cosmic language of divine kingship and eternal order. It was also what the ostraka said, and the letters and the medical texts, and the love poems, and the complaints about overdue rations, and the shopping lists, and the jokes written on broken pottery by people who simply had something to say, and the means to say it. The written word, in ancient Egypt, was the means by which the living spoke to the future. And the future, in the end, was patient enough to listen. The sun set in the west. It had always set in the west, and the Egyptians had always noticed. Every evening, without exception, the great disk of light that governed the Egyptian day moved through its arc across the sky and descended toward the western horizon, toward the desert, toward the cliffs that rose above the Nile Valley on its western bank, and caught the last of the day's color before the darkness came. And every morning, without exception, the sun reappeared in the east, renewed, having made its journey through the night, and emerged again into the world of the living. This daily pattern was not simply astronomical observation. It was, for the Egyptians, a text written in light, a daily enactment of the great cycle of death and renewal that they understood as the governing rhythm of existence itself. The sun died in the west each evening and was reborn in the east each morning. The dead, following the sun's example, went west, and in the west, in the desert beyond the cultivated fields, on the dry limestone plateau above the valley floor, they were placed in the earth to await their own renewal. The west bank of the Nile, across the river from the great living cities of Thebes and Memphis, and the other centers of Egyptian civilization, was the land of the dead. Not in a grim or frightening sense, the Egyptian understanding of death was not, at its core, a fearful one. It was a structured one. Death was a transition, a passage from one state of being to another, and the West Bank was the place where that transition was managed with the same care and attention to proper order that the Egyptians brought to every other important aspect of life. The tombs cut into the western cliffs and carved down into the desert plateau were not simply storage places for bodies. They were homes. Eternal homes, built and furnished and decorated with the understanding that the person who would inhabit them after death would need the same things that any person needs: food and drink, clothing and tools, familiar objects, the company of the people they had loved, the beauty of the world they had lived in, and the continued performance of the rituals that connected the living and the dead in a relationship of mutual sustenance. A family preparing the tomb of a parent or a spouse was doing something that carried genuine emotional weight alongside its religious significance. The objects placed in the tomb were chosen with care, not randomly or according to a rigid formula, but with attention to what the particular person had valued, what they had used, what had given them pleasure or comfort in life. A craftsman's tools, a woman's cosmetic containers, her mirror of polished bronze, her jewelry, a child's toys, a musician's instrument, food in clay jars, sealed carefully to preserve it. These objects were not simply symbolic. The Egyptians did not place a miniature of a food jar in a tomb and call it done. They placed actual food, actual bread, actual beer, actual dried meat and fish and fruit, because the belief was that the spirit of the deceased would require actual nourishment. The offering formula carved into tomb walls a standard text requesting that the gods provide thousands of loaves of bread, thousands of jars of beer, thousands of cuts of meat for the spirit of the named person was not hyperbole. It was a genuine wish, expressed in the formal language of religious hope. To ensure that nourishment would continue even if the physical offerings in the tomb were eventually consumed or disturbed, Egyptian tombs were provided with images. The painted walls of Egyptian tombs are among the most extraordinary artistic achievements of the ancient world, and their purpose was entirely practical in the Egyptian understanding. A painted scene of a banquet covering the wall of a tomb chapel was not simply a decoration or a memorial image. It was an eternal banquet one that would continue to provide sustenance for the spirit of the tomb owner as long as the paint remained on the wall and the correct ritual words had been spoken over it. A painted field of grain was an eternal field of grain. A painted garden with a pool, its surface covered with lotus flowers and its edges planted with palms and sycamores, was an eternal garden in which the spirit could rest. The detail and the care that Egyptian painters brought to these scenes is remarkable and, once noticed, deeply moving. In the tombs of wealthy officials and nobles from the New Kingdom period, the painted scenes are extraordinarily vivid. Fields are shown in careful detail, with the specific colors of different crops rendered accurately, and the figures of workers moving through them with the posture and tool use of real agricultural labor. Hunting scenes in the marshes show the birds rising from the papyrus reeds, with individualized detail, different species accurately depicted, their feathers and the tilt of their wings recognizable. Banquet scenes show musicians playing identifiable instruments, guests wearing garlands of lotus flowers and holding wine cups, servants moving between them with the practiced ease of people who know their work. These are not generic images of abundance and celebration. They are specific. They reflect the actual world that the tomb owner had lived in, the actual landscape of the Nile Valley. the actual plants and birds and fish of the river, the actual kinds of food and music and social gathering that made up the texture of Egyptian daily life. The person preparing a tomb was not simply following a formula. They were, in a very real sense, trying to preserve a world. The afterlife that Egyptians hoped to enter was not a remote, abstract paradise with no connection to earthly experience. It was something much more like a perfected continuation of the life they had already lived, a place of fields that were always fertile, of water that was always clean, of food that was always sufficient, of the company of the people they had loved, and of the absence of the hardships and uncertainties that had troubled their earthly lives. The field of reeds, the Egyptian term for this afterlife realm, Aru was imagined as a landscape recognizably similar to the Nile Valley, but better. Green and well-watered, with grain that grew taller than any earthly grain and harvests that never failed, and a quality of light that was, one imagines, something like the Egyptian landscape in its best and most golden moments, held permanently at that perfection. To reach this place required navigation. The journey of the dead through the underworld, through the region the Egyptians called the Duat, was not automatic or guaranteed. It required knowledge, preparation, and the successful passage through a series of judgments and challenges that tested the worthiness of the deceased. The most famous of these was the weighing of the heart, a ceremony depicted in countless tomb paintings and in the illustrated papyrus scrolls known as Books of the Dead, in which the heart of the deceased was weighed on a scale against the feather of Mat, the symbol of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was light, unburdened by wrongdoing, in balance with the feather, the deceased was declared worthy and passed onward to the field of reeds. If the heart was heavy, it was consumed by Emmet, a composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, and the person ceased to exist in any form, the true second death, the end of even the possibility of continuation. The Books of the Dead were essentially guides to this journey, collections of spells, declarations of innocence, prayers, and ritual formulae that the deceased could use to navigate the challenges of the underworld successfully. They were written on papyrus scrolls, placed within the wrappings of the mummy, or on the walls of the tomb, or on the surfaces of the coffin itself, so that the knowledge required for the journey was always immediately available to the traveler who needed it. The preparation of the body was undertaken with corresponding care. Mummification, the preservation of the physical body through a process of desiccation and treatment with natron, a naturally occurring salt, followed by wrapping in linen bandages and placement within a series of nested coffins, was understood as a necessary preparation for resurrection. The body needed to be preserved because the spirit, in its various forms, required a physical home to return to. Without a recognizable body, the spirit could not complete its journey and achieve the eternal life that the afterlife promised. The most elaborate mummification practices, as developed during the New Kingdom, were lengthy, expensive, and reserved for those with sufficient wealth and social position to afford them. For most ordinary Egyptians, burial was simply the body placed in the earth, perhaps with a few modest objects, in a desert cemetery where the dry heat of the sand provided natural preservation that could, across the centuries, be nearly as effective as the most elaborate embalming. What mattered, above all, was that the name was preserved. A carved name, a written name, a name spoken aloud by a living person passing by a tomb, these were understood as acts of sustenance. keeping the spirit of the named person alive in a way that went beyond metaphor. The formula carved at the entrance of many Egyptian tombs invited passers-by to speak the name of the tomb owner aloud, promising in return that the speaker would be rewarded by the gods for this small act of remembrance. It is a deeply human impulse, expressed in an entirely Egyptian way. The hope that someone, someday, will say your name, that you will not be entirely forgotten, that the marks you left on the world in stone, in paint, in the memory of those who came after, will keep some part of you present in the world that continues without you. As the sun descended toward the western horizon each evening, and the long shadow of the cliffs fell across the valley floor, and the farmers made their way home from the fields, and the boats were drawn up onto the bank, and the first lamps were lit in the mud brick houses of the village, the tombs in the western hills were already in darkness. They had been in darkness for a long time, most of them, but the names carved into their walls were still there, patient and quiet and waiting to be spoken. The sand is a patient archivist. It does not sort or select or judge. It simply covers, slowly and without preference, whatever lies in its path, the grand and the humble, the sacred and the ordinary, the things that people intended to preserve, and the things they simply set down one afternoon and never returned to collect. A temple wall and a woven sandal, a royal inscription and a child's wooden toy, a painted coffin and a clay jar of dried figs. The sand covered them all with the same indifferent thoroughness, and in covering them, kept them. The dry heat of the Egyptian desert is, in terms of the preservation of organic material, almost unequaled anywhere on Earth. Wood does not rot in the way it would in a wetter climate. Linen does not decay. Leather remains supple enough to be identified as leather thousands of years after it was last worn. Papyrus survives. Painted surfaces hold their color. Food placed in sealed jars remains recognizable grain, dried fruit, seeds, the residue of oils and wines and beers that can still be analyzed by modern chemistry to determine what they once contained. This means that ancient Egypt has left behind a record of ordinary life that is, in its texture and its intimacy, more complete than almost any other ancient civilization, not because the Egyptians were more careful or more deliberate archivists than other ancient peoples, though the scribes and administrators of Egypt were certainly meticulous, but because the conditions in which their material world was deposited happened to be among the most preserving on Earth. The rediscovery of that world has been a long and gradual process, conducted across many centuries and by people with many different purposes and many different levels of care. Ancient Egypt was never entirely forgotten by the world beyond its borders. The pyramids at Giza were recognized as extraordinary structures by every civilization that encountered them. From the Greeks who wrote about them with wonder to the medieval Arab scholars who measured and described them with analytical care. The monuments were visible. They were massive. They could not be ignored or overlooked even by the most casual traveler moving along the Nile. But the meaning behind the monuments, the language in which the inscriptions on their walls were written, the religious system that had given them their purpose, the daily life of the civilization that had built them these things, had grown inaccessible. The last people who could read hieroglyphs fluently had lived in the early centuries of the Common Era. And as the old religious traditions were displaced by Christianity and later by Islam, the knowledge of how to decode the ancient script faded and was eventually lost entirely. The temple walls spoke in a language that no living person could understand. What remained visible and accessible was the physical, the enormous, the durable. the things too large to disappear beneath the sand. But even these were sometimes surprising in their endurance, and sometimes surprising in their concealment. The Great Sphinx at Giza spent much of its history buried to the neck in sand, as already noted in our earlier journey through the Pyramid Plateau. The temples of Abu Simbel, carved by Ramses II into the living rock of a cliff face in Nubia, were known to exist from ancient accounts, but were not seen by European travelers until 1813, when the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt came across the upper portions of the 4 colossal seated figures that front the temple, their heads and shoulders emerging from the sand that had accumulated against the cliff face over the centuries. The full temples were not cleared and entered until the following year. The experience of encountering a half-buried monument must have had a quality that is difficult to fully recover in imagination, not the staged discovery of a museum exhibit where the object is presented cleanly and completely in a controlled context, but the genuine encounter with something enormous emerging from the earth in the middle of a landscape of sand and rock and silence. The upper portion of a face, a stone face, many meters tall, its expression calm, and its proportions entirely alien to the surrounding desert visible above the sand as a traveler came around a bend in the river or descended from a ridge. Something enormous, partially hidden, suggesting by the fragment that was visible the full scale of what lay beneath. The 19th century brought increasing systematic attention to the monuments and artifacts of ancient Egypt, along with, it must be said, a period of significant removal of objects from their original contexts. Egyptian antiquities found their way into collections across Europe and beyond, sometimes through formal arrangements with the Egyptian authorities of the day, and sometimes through means that were considerably less formal. The great museums of London, Paris, Berlin, Turin, and other cities accumulated collections of Egyptian objects that ranged from monumental sculpture to the most intimate personal possessions. The ethics of those removals are understood differently today than they were at the time, and the question of where Egyptian antiquities properly belong is one that continues to be discussed with genuine seriousness in our own era. But the collections themselves, whatever the circumstances of their assembly, did serve to bring the material evidence of Egyptian civilization to the attention of a wide audience across the world, and the scholarly work conducted on those collections contributed significantly to the decipherment of the hieroglyphic script and the reconstruction of Egyptian history. The decipherment of hieroglyphs, when it finally came through Champollion's work in the early 19th century, was not simply an academic achievement. It was the opening of a conversation that had been interrupted for more than 1,000 years. The voices that came through the royal proclamations, the religious hymns, the administrative records, the love poems, the medical texts, the letters, the jokes on broken pottery were not the voices of a dead civilization in the sense of one that had ceased to be human. They were entirely recognizable human voices, speaking of entirely recognizable human concerns in a language that was unfamiliar but whose content, once translated, was not. This is perhaps the most quietly remarkable aspect of Egyptian rediscovery. The expectation, encountering a civilization separated from the present by 3,500 years, might be that its concerns would be alien, incomprehensible in their assumptions, remote in their values, requiring extensive scholarly mediation before anything like direct human contact could be felt. And there are certainly aspects of Egyptian thought and practice that require careful contextualization to understand. But there are also the ostraka from Deir el Medina, with their records of workers complaining about late wages. There are the letters in which parents write to children living in distant cities, asking why they haven't written, worrying about their health, sending small gifts of food. There are the medical texts in which physicians describe their observations of patients with the careful, frustrated honesty of people who are doing their best with limited tools in the face of suffering they cannot always relieve. There are the love poems in which a young man describes the effect that a particular young woman has on his ability to think clearly and go about his day in a normal fashion, an experience that has not changed meaningfully in the intervening millennia. Walking through the ruins of an Egyptian site at sunset is an experience that people who have done it describe in remarkably consistent terms. Not awe in the overwhelming sense, not the kind of emotion that prevents thought, but something quieter and more sustained, a sense of presence, of layers, of a world that existed so completely and for so long that its absence cannot be total. The stones are still there, the carvings are still there, the color in the most protected places is still there. A visitor standing in the hypostyle hall at Karnak in the late afternoon, when the light falls through the clerestory openings at a low angle and catches the carvings on the columns in a way that makes them suddenly three-dimensional and vivid, is standing in a space that has been standing for more than 3,000 years. The priests who walked these stone floors are gone. The incense and the music and the daily ceremony of the morning rite are gone. But the space remains, and it retains something, a quality of intention, perhaps, or simply the accumulated weight of all the human attention that has been directed at these stones over the long centuries. The objects that have come out of the sand tell their own quieter stories. A pair of leather sandals found in a tomb, still shaped to the foot that wore them. A child's wooden horse on wheels, its paint faded but its form entirely legible, a toy made for a child, to be pulled along the floor of a mud brick house in a village beside the Nile. A comb of carved bone, its teeth intact, found beside the wrapped body of a woman who had used it to dress her hair on ordinary mornings in a world that no longer exists. A basket of dried figs, sealed and placed in a storeroom and forgotten, still containing the desiccated fruit after 4,000 years. These things were not made for posterity. They were made for use, and they were used, and they were set down, and the sand covered them, and they endured. It is a gentle reminder that the greatest archive of any civilization is not its most monumental achievements, but its most ordinary ones. The pyramids tell us about the ambitions of Egyptian kings and the organizational capacity of the Egyptian state. The ostraka tell us about the daily reality of Egyptian life. Both are necessary. But it is the ordinary things, the sandal, the comb, the toy, the basket of figs, that bring the past closest to the present. Ancient Egypt's greatest legacy is not a single monument or a single ruler or a single idea, remarkable as all of these are. It is the simple cumulative evidence that here, beside this river, for an extraordinarily long period of time, people lived. They farmed and fished and built and wrote and prayed and celebrated and grieved and loved and worked and rested and raised children and grew old and died and were buried with care by people who hoped they would not be forgotten. The sand kept what they left behind, and the sand, in the end, gave it back. We have come a long way tonight. From the first light gathering above the eastern desert cliffs to the green ribbon of the valley stretching between water and sand, to the villages waking before sunrise with the sound of grinding grain and distant birds. We have drifted through the rhythm of the flood, through the patient work of farmers pressing seeds into dark soil, through the first stone monuments rising against a pale sky. We have moved along the river on boats of cedar and papyrus, through markets and workshops and temple courtyards and scribal rooms lit by small oil lamps. We have stood in the hypostyle hall at Karnak and walked the quiet paths of the West Bank in the long shadow of the afternoon. It has been, as ancient Egypt always is, a world both vast and intimate, a world of enormous things, pyramids rising from desert plateaus, temples carved from living rock, obelisks catching the morning light above the rooftops of cities, and also a world of small things. A child's toy, a basket of figs, a love poem on a broken piece of pottery, a comb left beside someone who had used it on ordinary mornings for the whole of a life now ended. Both the vast and the small were ancient Egypt, and both deserve to be remembered with equal gentleness. The river was always there beneath all of it. The Nile moved through the whole story the way it moved through the landscape itself, quietly, reliably, without urgency, carrying on its surface the boats and the light and the reflection of the sky, and in its annual flood carrying the dark soil that made everything else possible. The flood came and went across 3,000 years of kings and temples and ordinary lives, indifferent to any particular ruler or any particular event, governed only by the distant rains falling in the mountains of eastern Africa and the slow pull of the current moving north toward the sea. Farmers watched for it and measured it and gave thanks for it. Priests announced its arrival with ceremony and connected its timing to the stars. Children played at its edges and fishermen read its surface, and sailors trusted its current and its wind to carry them where they needed to go. And when it came well, when it rose to the right level and held long enough to soak the soil, and then retreated cleanly, the whole valley exhaled together, with the quiet relief of a world working as it should. That is, perhaps, the feeling that ancient Egypt offers most reliably across the great distance of time. The feeling of a world working as it should. Not a perfect world. Not a world without hardship or injustice or suffering or the ordinary difficulties of human life. But a world with a rhythm, a deep, reliable rhythm of water and soil and season that gave the people who lived within it a framework for understanding their days and their years and their lives and their deaths, and a sense that the order of things, maintained through right action and proper ceremony, and the patient work of ordinary life, would continue. Let that rhythm settle now. Let the flood recede from the fields, and the dark soil dry slowly in the morning sun. Let the farmers walk out to their furrows with seeds held in their palms. Let the oxen move in slow circles on the threshing floor. Let the grain rise in the clay jars and the granaries fill, and the village rest in the long heat of the afternoon, with the river moving past and the palms barely moving, and the sky enormous and blue above the desert cliffs. Let the boats drift on the current toward the north, their sails slack in the still morning air. Let the temple lamps burn low in the innermost sanctuary, the incense smoke rising in a slow thread through the darkness toward the painted stars on the ceiling above. Let the sacred lake hold its reflection of the night sky undisturbed. Let the priests complete their morning rituals and retire to their ordinary lives in the ordinary world beyond the temple walls, where bread is baking and children are calling to each other in the courtyard, and a cat is sleeping in the sun beside the door. Let the scribe set down his reed brush, and rest his hand, the lamp beside him burning to its end. Let the signs he has copied remain on the surface before him, patient, permanent, carrying within their careful forms the names and the prayers and the small daily records that outlasted everything around them. Let the west bank fall into its long evening shadow. Let the names carved into the tomb walls remain in their darkness, waiting without urgency for the voice that will speak them again someday, giving them back for a moment to the world of sound and presence. Let the pyramid stand in the desert silence as the stars appear above them, the same stars that the priests read from the temple rooftops and the sailors navigated by, and the farmers used to mark the turning of the year. The stars have not moved very much across the 4,500 years since the Great Pyramid was completed. They are still there, turning slowly above the Giza plateau in the darkness, above the sand and the river and the date palms and the fields. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary endurance. It gave the world monuments that have outlasted every other structure built in their era. It developed a system of writing that preserved 3,000 years of human thought and feeling in daily life in a form that modern scholarship has unlocked and returned to us. It produced art of such consistency and beauty that it remains immediately recognizable and immediately affecting across the full distance of time that separates us from it. But it was also simply a place where people lived, where families gathered at the end of the day in mud brick courtyards and ate their bread and their onions and their dried fish and their dates, where children played beside the river and were called in at dusk by voices that have been silent for 3,000 years, where old men sat in the shade of sycamore trees and watched the light change on the water the way old men have always watched the light change on water everywhere, where the smell of bread baking and incense burning and river mud and desert wind all mingled together in the warm air of a valley that was, for all its extraordinary history, also just to place a green ribbon between sand and water, watched over by stars, home to a great many ordinary human lives. Let that world drift now, softly, into the distance. Let the river carry it gently northward toward the sea. Let the sand settle over the quieter things, the sandals and the combs and the toys and the baskets of figs, and keep them safe until the time comes to return them. Let the lamps grow low. Let the voices of the market and the temple and the threshing floor and the scribal room and the riverside village grow quiet, one by one. The way sounds always fade at the end of a long and full day. The Nile is moving in the darkness. The stars are out above the desert. The old world is resting, as it has rested for a very long time, beneath the eternal sands. And so, now, can you sleep well and good night.